Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. This is the place where we leave the famous speeches, the grand monuments, and the polished version of the past behind for a while, and spend our time with the parts of history that were usually messier than anyone remembers. The streets people complained about, the neighbourhoods respectable citizens preferred not to visit, the arguments that happened before anyone knew which side would eventually be called respectable. Tonight, we are going to Atlanta. But not the Atlanta of glass towers, interstate highways, airports, stadiums, and crowded downtown streets. We're going back to an Atlanta so young that people could still remember when it had been little more than a railroad settlement. A place where streets were rough, local government was small, drinking establishments were numerous, and one district just beyond the city's effective reach developed a reputation so bad that people gave it a name that sounded less like a neighbourhood and more like a warning: Snake Nation. It is one of those names that almost seems invented after the fact. It was not. Snake Nation was associated with the area south and west of early downtown Atlanta, in and around what would later become Castleberry Hill. Historical accounts remember it as a collection of rough dwellings occupied by people connected with gambling, illegal liquor, prostitution, itinerant medicine selling, and the general nightlife of a railroad town that was growing much faster than its institutions could keep up with. Most importantly for our story, parts of this settlement sat beyond Atlanta's original municipal boundary, which made controlling it a serious problem for a city government that was already struggling to maintain order inside its own limits. Before we go there, I have a question for you. Where are you listening from tonight? And if you have ever been to Atlanta, think for a moment about the version of the city you know. Maybe you remember the traffic, maybe downtown, maybe the stadium. Maybe you have walked through Castleberry Hill without knowing that people once used the words Snake Nation for roughly this part of town. If you want to, leave your city or country in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you find these slower journeys into overlooked history relaxing, you can subscribe and give the video a like. There is no need to interrupt what you're doing. Settle in first. Get comfortable. We have plenty of time. Because to understand why Snake Nation existed, we first need to understand something important about Atlanta. Atlanta was not an old southern city. When Snake Nation acquired its reputation, Atlanta itself was barely established. Savannah had existed for more than a century. Charleston was already an old port city. Even Augusta had generations of history behind it. Atlanta was different. Atlanta existed because somebody needed a place for railroad tracks to meet. In 1837, engineers working for Georgia's Western and Atlantic Railroad selected a point in North Georgia as the southern end of the planned line toward Chattanooga. A settlement began developing around the location. It became known as Terminus, an unusually honest name for a town because that was exactly what it was, the end of the railroad. The settlement was later called Marthasville. The name Atlanta followed during the 1840s, and the place was formally incorporated as the City of Atlanta in 1847. Rail connections were already transforming it. The Georgia Railroad linked the settlement eastward toward Augusta, while another line connected Atlanta toward Macon. What had begun as an endpoint was becoming a junction. That distinction matters. Atlanta did not slowly grow around a courthouse square for 100 years. It arrived quickly. Workers arrived because of the railroads. Merchants arrived because of the workers. Hotels appeared because travellers needed somewhere to sleep. Warehouses appeared because freight needed somewhere to sit. Taverns and saloons appeared because railroad labourers, travellers, merchants, wagon drivers and strangers had money in their pockets and wanted somewhere to spend it. Then more people arrived because all of those people were already there. This was growth without much preparation. A description preserved by the city of Atlanta gives a useful sense of how abrupt it was. By 1847, the young city had nearly 2,500 inhabitants, around 50 substantial stores and 2 hotels, while shanties remained scattered through the surrounding woods. The The streets themselves could still be clogged with roots and tree stumps. 4 important roads converge near the centre: Peachtree, Decatur, Marietta and Whitehall. Try to remove the modern city from your mind. There is no skyline. There is no pavement. There are no traffic lights. There is no professional police department in anything like the form you would recognise today. There are trains, wagons, horses, wooden buildings, boarding houses, workshops, stores, mud, dust, smoke, livestock, temporary labourers, and people constantly arriving from somewhere else. You hear hammers. You hear wagon wheels striking rough ground. You hear men shouting around freight. Then, several times during the day, you hear something that explains why all of this is here in the first place: a locomotive. Steam engines were changing the economic geography of Georgia, and Atlanta happened to be standing in exactly the right location. A railroad town could grow quickly because the railroad brought almost everything required for growth. It brought customers, it brought building materials, it brought manufactured goods, it brought mail, it brought news, it brought workers looking for wages, it also brought strangers. That last category created problems. A person could arrive in a town like Atlanta without having family there, without belonging to a church there, without owning property there, and without having neighbours who knew his reputation. He could work for a few weeks, collect his money, drink, gamble, fight, and leave. For local authorities, that kind of population was difficult to manage. For saloon keepers, gamblers, and anyone making money from transient customers, it was excellent business. By around 1850, accounts describe Atlanta as having more than 40 saloons, despite a population still measured only in the thousands. Drinking, gambling, and prostitution were well established enough that politics in the city began dividing around the question of how much of this behaviour should be tolerated. And that is where the neat image of an old southern town begins to fall apart. Early Atlanta was not yet the place that later generations would advertise as a major commercial capital of the South. It was trying to become that place. Those are 2 very different conditions. A city trying to become respectable notices disorder more intensely because disorder threatens the future that its businessmen and civic leaders are attempting to build. Imagine that you own a general store in Atlanta in 1849. You've invested money and property because you believe the railroad will make this town important. You want more merchants to arrive. You want families to settle permanently. You want land values to rise. You want warehouses, workshops, banks, churches, and better roads. You want investors passing through town to look around and think that Atlanta is a safe place to put money. Then imagine that a short walk away there are taverns full of fighting, gambling rooms, brothels, illegal liquor cellars, rough shanties, and groups of men who do not appear particularly concerned about what the city council thinks. Those establishments are not merely offending your moral standards. They may be threatening your investment. This is one of the reasons the conflict that developed in Atlanta cannot be understood simply as respectable people fighting bad people. There was morality involved, certainly. Religion was involved. Temperance was involved. But money, property, commerce, class, and political control were involved as well. Snake Nation stood near the point where all of those interests collided. Atlanta's physical boundary made the situation even more difficult. When the city was incorporated in 1847, its municipal limits extended roughly 1 mile in every direction from the state railroad depot. That gave Atlanta a clearly defined legal circle. Inside that circle, the city government could pass and enforce municipal regulations. Beyond it, Atlanta's direct authority ended. A mile sounds like a considerable distance if you imagine walking through a modern downtown. In a settlement this small, it was not. You could leave the centre of Atlanta and reach the edge of municipal authority without making a journey that felt remotely like leaving the community. People living just outside the boundary could still depend on Atlanta. They could work there. They could sell things there. They could drink there. They could gamble with people who lived there. They could cause trouble there. Then they could retreat beyond the line where the city's municipal machinery stopped. This did not mean that Snake Nation existed in some independent republic where no Georgia law applied. State and county authority did not disappear at Atlanta's boundary. When historical writers described the district as lawless, they were describing weak enforcement, vice, disorder, and a place beyond the convenient reach of Atlanta's municipal rules, not a territory where law literally ceased to exist. That difference is worth keeping in mind because the legend of Snake Nation has grown over time. The reality is interesting enough without making it into something it was not. Snake Nation was dangerous to Atlanta's leaders precisely because it was close. If it had been 20 miles away, it would have been somebody else's problem. Instead, it sat along the expanding edge of a city determined to grow. Historical accounts place Snake Nation around the old Whitehall Road area, south and west of the Central Railroad activity, associated today with Castleberry Hill. The district consisted largely of modest wooden structures and rough housing, rather than the brick commercial buildings that would characterize the area later. The origin of the name itself is less certain than some retellings suggest. Several explanations survive. One claims that itinerant vendors selling patent medicines or so-called snake oil were common there. Another tradition connects the name with a healer associated with snake remedies. A simpler explanation says the residents had such a reputation for violence and dishonesty that outsiders called them snakes. There is no need to choose one of these stories as definitely correct. The evidence does not give us that luxury. What matters is that by the time the name entered Atlanta's memory, everybody understood what it implied. Snake Nation was not where respectable Atlanta believed respectable people belonged. That description should also make us cautious. Most surviving histories of places like Snake Nation were written by the people who wanted them removed. That matters. Words such as criminal, immoral, degraded, vicious, and disreputable appear easily in old civic histories because the writers often shared the assumptions of the reformers. The people living in these settlements rarely left long diaries explaining themselves. A saloon keeper did not usually preserve a detailed memoir describing why he chose that business. A poor woman living in a shanty outside the city line did not generally deposit her papers in an archive. A sex worker chased from a district did not usually get to write the official account of what happened. So the record is uneven. We know much more about what Atlanta's reformers thought of Snake Nation than we know about what Snake Nation thought of Atlanta's reformers. That imbalance is going to follow us through this story. It does not mean that the reports of violence and criminal activity should simply be dismissed. Early Atlanta did have a serious disorder problem. One early history described gambling as an everyday occurrence, and occasional murder as part of the challenge facing municipal authorities. The same account portrayed the population as containing large numbers of railroad workers and other transient labourers, and noted how many responsibilities could fall onto a tiny city government. Atlanta's first elected mayors stepped into an office that had very little institutional support compared with a modern mayor. There was no enormous city bureaucracy behind the desk, no modern police force waiting for instructions, no fleet of patrol cars, no radio network, no emergency telephone number. If a fight began in a saloon, someone had to physically get help. If a prisoner was arrested, the city needed somewhere capable of keeping him. If a crowd gathered, the authorities had to find enough men willing to confront it. If trouble occurred beyond the municipal boundary, matters became even more complicated. This is the Atlanta that produced Snake Nation. Not a functioning modern city that inexplicably allowed a lawless neighbourhood to appear. A frontier-like railroad settlement trying to become a functioning city, while the population, business, vice, and physical footprint were expanding almost simultaneously. There were opportunities everywhere. There were gaps everywhere too. Snake Nation lived in one of those gaps. During daylight, someone walking toward the district might have passed wagons carrying freight, small houses, workshops, piles of timber, tethered horses, children in the road, and men coming and going from railroad work. Nothing required an ominous soundtrack. People lived there. People ate there. People slept there. Some people undoubtedly went about ordinary work. But as evening approached, the businesses that gave the district its reputation became more active. Liquor mattered enormously in this world. Whiskey was cheap, transportable, profitable, and deeply embedded in social life. A saloon was not merely somewhere to buy a drink. It could be a meeting place, gambling room, political headquarters, hiring point, information exchange, and a reliable location for finding several men who were already angry about something. That last function became important during elections. Atlanta's argument over public behaviour soon developed into organised political factions. On one side were people who became associated with the moral party. Their supporters included temperance advocates, evangelical Protestants, merchants, reformers, and citizens who believed Atlanta's future required stricter enforcement and a more orderly public life. Opposing them were supporters of what became known as the Free and Rowdy Party. It is difficult to imagine a political organisation choosing that name today, but early Atlanta was not subtle about the disagreement. The Rowdies favoured a much more permissive approach toward drinking, gambling, and the businesses that surrounded them. Their political base overlapped with the saloon culture of the young railroad town, and Snake Nation became closely associated with their side. Atlanta's first 3 mayors were identified with the rowdy faction, before the reform movement finally succeeded in electing Jonathan Norcross. We will get to Norcross. For the moment, leave him outside the room. The more useful question is why a rowdy party could win elections at all, because that tells us something important about Atlanta. The people later described as troublemakers were not merely hiding in alleys, while the real city went about its business. They had votes, they had allies, they owned businesses, they knew candidates, they influenced elections, they were part of Atlanta. This is what made the coming conflict so bitter. The argument was not Atlanta against outsiders, it was Atlanta against itself. One group looked at the railroad boom and saw a city that needed discipline if it was ever going to become wealthy and important. Another group looked at the same growing town and saw customers, personal freedom, business opportunities, and no good reason for ministers and merchants to decide what everyone else was allowed to drink, buy, sell, or do after dark. Neither side approached the disagreement as a harmless difference of opinion. The stakes grew quickly. Election campaigns involved alcohol, personal confrontation, accusations, and public disorder. An early account of Jonathan Norcross's campaign remembered his faction distributing fruit and candy to attract voters, while his opponent's supporters relied on whiskey and other stimulants. The detail sounds almost comic until you remember that this was a contest for control of a city where political enforcement depended heavily on who could physically command the streets. Snake Nation therefore cannot be separated from Atlanta politics. The settlement's reputation came from vice, but its real historical importance came from power. People there belonged to a larger network of saloon owners, labourers, gamblers, political supporters, and other citizens who had helped determine who governed Atlanta. For several years their side was winning. That meant anyone who wanted Snake Nation gone could not simply complain about it. They had to defeat the political structure protecting the kind of life that flourished there. And once they did defeat it, another problem appeared. Winning an election was much easier than making the losing side obey. That is where the familiar story of Snake Nation begins to become stranger. Atlanta's early jail was notoriously inadequate. Later accounts describe prisoners escaping with embarrassing ease. One story tells of friends actually helping detainees get out by lifting part of the crude structure so men could crawl free beneath it. Whether every colourful detail survived exactly as it happened is difficult to prove, but the larger point is well supported. Atlanta's enforcement institutions were weak, and people who did not respect municipal authority had good reason to believe the city could be defied. You can begin to see the problem facing reformers. Pass a rule. Someone ignores it. Arrest him. His friends help him escape. Close a disorderly establishment inside Atlanta. Its operators move toward the edge. Push them farther. They establish themselves just outside the boundary. The city a drawnest circle around itself on paper. Human behaviour did not respect the circle. and the railroad kept bringing more people, more workers, more travellers, more money, more alcohol. More opportunities to disappear into a crowd. That combination gave Atlanta an atmosphere very different from the later image of a settled southern commercial city. It was young enough that nobody could be entirely sure what kind of place it was going to become. The future had not been decided. Respectability was competing with disorder in real time. Snake Nation was one of the places where that competition became visible. There is another reason I want us to remain here for a little while before rushing toward the riots, the cannon, the election, and the night when armed citizens finally took matters into their own hands. Places acquire reputations faster than they acquire records. Once a neighbourhood becomes known as dangerous, every robbery nearby belongs to it. Every fight confirms the story. Every stranger becomes suspicious. Every exaggerated account is repeated. Soon the name itself does some of the work. Tell someone in early Atlanta that a man spent his evening in Snake Nation, and you have already told them what they are supposed to think about him. That makes reconstructing daily life difficult. Snake Nation was certainly associated with vice and disorder. Contemporary and early historical accounts consistently agree on that much. But it was also a physical place where poor and marginal people lived, because rough housing outside the most desirable parts of town was what they could afford. Those two realities can exist together. A neighbourhood can be dangerous and still contain ordinary people. A saloon district can contain criminals and workers. A reform movement can have legitimate complaints about violence, and still use illegitimate violence in response. That last point will become especially important later, because Atlanta's respectable citizens eventually decided that ordinary law was not solving the problem. And once respectable citizens decide that the law is too weak to accomplish what they want, the definition of lawlessness becomes very complicated. The men who complained about mob behaviour would eventually behave like a mob. The people demanding public order would eventually operate in disguise. The citizens who wanted Atlanta governed by law would help destroy settlements outside the ordinary legal process. Early history is often presented what followed as the moment decent Atlanta finally defeated its undesirable element. Modern readers have good reason to look at that story more carefully. One early Atlanta history records that disguised men attacked Snake Nation and Slab Town, whipped male residents, forcibly removed women, warned inhabitants to leave, and burned the settlements. We are not there yet. Before anybody put on a disguise, before buildings burned, before the moral party managed to break the rowdies' political control, Snake Nation had to become powerful enough to frighten the people who wanted it gone. That happened during the years when Atlanta itself was still learning how to function. So picture the city again, only this time do not look from above. Stand near the centre where the railroad tracks meet. Behind you is the depot. Around you are stores, wagons, boarding houses, saloons, men looking for work, merchants arguing over freight, horses shifting in harness, smoke hanging near the tracks, and streets that still become unpleasant after rain. Then begin walking south and west. You follow the old Whitehall route away from the most concentrated business activity. The structures become rougher. The authority of the city becomes less certain. Somewhere ahead are cheap wooden dwellings and drinking establishments whose customers have no particular affection for Atlanta's growing reform movement. The people there know exactly what the respectable merchants call their neighbourhood, Snake Nation. And before Atlanta could destroy it, Atlanta first had to live beside it. If you had walked away from Atlanta's railroad depot in the late 1840s and followed the route toward Whitehall, you would not have needed much time to leave the part of town that Atlanta's merchants wanted visitors to notice. The settlement was still small enough that distances we would barely think about today could take you from the commercial centre to a very different environment. Near the railroad you would find warehouses, stores, boarding houses, freight wagons, horses, labourers, and the growing collection of businesses that existed because several important rail lines were beginning to meet there. Continue south and west, however, and the buildings became less substantial. Streets were rough, Houses became smaller, wooden shanties appeared, the city's authority became less visible. The road itself was older than Atlanta. Before anyone called the place Terminus, Marthasville, or Atlanta, travellers were already moving through this part of Georgia. The route later known as Whitehall Road followed part of an older path that local historical accounts identify with the Sandtown Trail, a route that had connected native communities across the region long before the railroad town existed. Whitehall Road eventually ran from the young settlement toward a stopping place known simply as Whitehall. Whitehall was named for an inn established by Charner Humphreys during the 1830s. An early history of Atlanta remembered it as a group of simple buildings that had been painted white at a time when most structures in the surrounding countryside were not painted at all. Travellers began referring to the place by its most obvious feature. It became Whitehall, and the road leading toward it inherited the name. The inn served travellers and also functioned as a local meeting place, before Atlanta had grown into anything resembling a city. This means that when railroad workers and newcomers began filling the area during the 1840s, they were not entering a blank landscape. Roads, farms, paths, taverns, and older patterns of movement were already there. Atlanta grew on top of them. That growth happened quickly. Georgia had begun developing the Western and Atlantic Railroad in the late 1830s, and the location that became Atlanta was selected as its southern terminus. Other rail connections followed. Transportation created the city and continued to determine where people worked, where businesses opened, and which streets became important. Atlanta's later identity as a major transportation centre was already visible when the place contained only a few thousand people. Whitehall Road became important because it carried people and goods between the railroad settlement and communities farther south and west. It was not some isolated lane leading toward nowhere. Wagons used it. Travellers used it. Workers moved along it. Businesses developed around it. And where traffic gathered, money followed. Where money followed, entertainment usually appeared. That pattern is not unique to Atlanta. You can find versions of it around ports, mining towns, military posts, canal settlements, cattle towns, and railroad junctions throughout history. Large numbers of men arrive without families. Many are paid in cash. Some remain for only a short period. Boarding houses open. Taverns open. Gambling follows. Prostitution follows. Informal businesses appear around all of them. Atlanta developed quickly enough that this social world appeared before municipal institutions were prepared to regulate it effectively. By 1850, the city had a population of only a few thousand, yet contemporary and later accounts describe more than 40 saloons operating there. Georgia Public Broadcasting's History of Castleberry Hill describes early Atlanta as much closer to a rough railroad boomtown than the polished southern city later generations like to imagine. 40 saloons in a town that's small tells you something. It does not tell you that everyone in Atlanta spent every evening drunk. It tells you that there was enough demand for alcohol to support an extraordinary number of establishments. Many customers were railroad workers, others were wagon drivers, craftsmen, merchants, travellers, and men passing through town. Saloons offered more than liquor. A person might hear news there, find work there, meet political organisers there, arrange a bet there, or encounter someone he had been trying to avoid. They could also become violent. A crowded drinking establishment in the middle of the 19th century had few of the controls we associate with licensed bars today. There was no modern security staff. Police protection was minimal. Men commonly carried knives, pistols, or other weapons. Arguments could become physical quickly. Alcohol made that easier. Move beyond the better regulated parts of the city and the problem became worse. The stretch of Whitehall Road associated with Snake Nation ran from around the railroad crossing south toward Fair Street, through the area that later became Castleberry Hill. Historical descriptions repeatedly call it a shanty settlement. The buildings were mostly rough wooden structures rather than impressive commercial blocks. Drinking establishments Gambling rooms, brothels, and other businesses associated with vice became concentrated there. Local neighbourhood histories also preserve references to cockfighting and illegal liquor activity. There is an important word in those old descriptions that deserves some attention. Shanty. When a 19th century newspaper writer used that word, he was describing a type of building, but he was also making a judgment about the people inside it. A shanty was temporary, inexpensive, poorly built, and associated with poverty. Calling a place a shanty town told the reader that this was not a district of established property owners with substantial houses and carefully maintained yards. That difference mattered enormously in early Atlanta. Property ownership carried social influence. Merchants who owned buildings had an obvious interest in stable government, predictable law enforcement, and rising property values. A labourer staying temporarily in a wooden room had much less reason to care whether a particular street became more attractive to long-term investors. This helps explain why arguments about Snake Nation were never only about alcohol. They were also arguments about what kind of population Atlanta wanted. The distinction becomes especially clear when you look at descriptions of nearby residential areas. An early 20th century history drawing on pioneer memories described some of Atlanta's most fashionable early residents living along Alabama and South Forsyth Streets toward Peters Street. That same account described Castleberry Hill, near the railroad crossing and the junction of Walker and Peters Streets, as having an unsavoury reputation, and remembered it as Atlanta's Midway. The contrast could exist within a short walk. That is something modern city maps can hide from us. We look at a neighbourhood boundary and imagine that people living inside it shared a common identity. Early Atlanta did not work so neatly. A respectable merchant's home could stand surprisingly close to a saloon that the same merchant wanted closed. A street used by freight wagons during the day could become associated with drinking and gambling after dark. Whitehall Road was both useful and disreputable. Atlanta needed the traffic. Some Atlantans disliked the people who gathered around it. Those two facts existed at the same time. Consider what the road might have looked like during an ordinary afternoon around 1849. A wagon arrives carrying agricultural products from the countryside. Another wagon moves in the opposite direction with manufactured goods brought into Atlanta by rail. A man on horseback passes them. Somewhere nearby a blacksmith is working. You might hear metal striking metal from a shop while a locomotive whistles closer to the centre of town. There are no paved lanes separating traffic. People walk around animals, wagons stop where they need to stop. Rain can turn the road into mud. Dry weather creates dust. A traveller looking for food or a drink does not search an app or consult a list of licensed businesses. He notices signs, asks someone, or follows noise toward an establishment where other people have already gathered. By evening the character changes. Men who have finished work begin spending wages. Card games start. Dice appear. Someone produces whiskey. Arguments become louder. People who earn money from those customers arrive because evening is their working time. A house that appears almost anonymous during daylight may be well known locally as a place where gambling takes place. Another may operate as a brothel. A third sells liquor without much concern for whatever rules city reformers would prefer to enforce. No single establishment creates Snake Nation. Concentration does. When enough businesses with similar reputations gather close together, the area acquires an identity of its own. People begin saying that trouble happened in Snake Nation even when they cannot identify the exact building. The name becomes shorthand. This is where the problem of historical evidence becomes important again. We know what reformers called the district. We know what later Atlanta histories said about it. We know newspapers associated it with crime and immorality. But we have far fewer records from the people who actually lived there. That means we should be careful with descriptions suggesting that every resident was a criminal. Poor housing does not make someone a criminal. Living near a brothel does not make someone a prostitute. Working in a saloon does not prove someone committed violence. There were undoubtedly labourers, families, craftsmen, and people simply trying to afford shelter mixed into the same physical environment. Yet the evidence is strong that the district had a real concentration of vice businesses and a serious reputation for violence. The Castleberry Hill Neighbourhood Association's summary, drawing on the historic district nomination, describes Snake Nation in the late 1840s and early 1850s as a settlement along Whitehall Road, known for drinking and gambling houses, brothels, and serious criminal activity. So we do not need to choose between two extremes. Snake Nation was not an innocent neighbourhood invented entirely by prejudiced reformers. It was also not a settlement where every person was some cartoon villain waiting outside a saloon with a pistol. Real neighbourhoods are more complicated than that. There were people making money from crime. There were people making money from legal businesses. There were people making money in ways that fell somewhere between the two. There were people who probably did not make much money at all, and all of them lived close to one of the fastest growing railroad centres in Georgia. The amount of wagon traffic moving into Atlanta increased as the city became a regional market. One pioneer account recalled that the wagon trade became enormous after 1848 and remained important until additional railroad connections changed transportation patterns. Think about what that meant for Whitehall Road. The road was not only carrying local residents. Country farmers came toward Atlanta with goods to sell. Drivers hauled cotton and agricultural products. People brought livestock. Merchants sent shipments outward. Travellers looked for places to eat and sleep. A settlement located along such a route could survive by serving that traffic. Food could be sold. Liquor could be sold. Lodging could be sold. Gambling could be offered. Sex could be sold. A dishonest merchant could cheat strangers who would be gone tomorrow. A gambler did not need repeat customers if new customers arrived every day. Snake Nation existed beside a transportation economy that continuously supplied potential customers. The railroad deserves special attention because it created a population that was difficult for a small community to absorb. Railroad construction required large numbers of labourers. Railroad operations required additional workers once the lines opened. Freight activity attracted warehouse labour. Taverns needed employees. Hotels needed workers. Shops needed craftsmen. Not all these people intended to stay. A stable town depends heavily on reputation. If you expect to live beside the same neighbours for 20 years, consequences follow you. If you cheat a customer today, he might tell everyone you know. If you start a fight, the victim's brother may live down the road. If you fail to pay a debt, people remember. Transient populations weaken that kind of informal control. A man passing through Atlanta could behave badly and simply leave on the next train or wagon route. The town authorities could not easily track him. There were no photographs attached to identification documents. No computer records, no central criminal database, no instant communication with surrounding communities. Names could be changed, stories could be invented. A person might arrive claiming to be a doctor, merchant, mechanic, labourer or veteran with very little immediate way for strangers to confirm it. That environment helps explain another group associated in later stories with the name Snake Nation: itinerant medicine sellers. The connection may or may not actually explain the neighbourhood's name. Different traditions offer different origins, and the surviving evidence does not settle the issue conclusively. But sellers of patent medicines and questionable cures were certainly familiar figures in 19th century America. A convincing speaker could sell a bottle of something to people suffering from pain, illness, or fear, and move on before customers discovered that the treatment did nothing. The phrase snake oil later became a general expression for fraudulent medicine, making the supposed connection with Snake Nation irresistible to storytellers. But we should not pretend certainty where certainty does not exist. The safest historical conclusion is simpler. People called the district Snake Nation. The name was already associated with its bad reputation. Exactly why the first person chose those words remains unclear. And perhaps the uncertainty fits the place better than a tidy origin story would. Whitehall Road itself would eventually lose its name in this part of Atlanta. Local historical accounts indicate that the section through what became Castleberry Hill was renamed Peter Street around the early 1850s, honouring railroad figure Richard Peters. That change is easy to overlook, but it captures what was happening around Snake Nation. Atlanta was naming streets, opening streets, extending streets, building rail connections, creating municipal institutions, selling property, encouraging commerce, trying to turn a rough transportation settlement into a recognisable city. In 1848, for example, the Atlanta City Council received a petition for a street running from a bridge across the Macon and Western Railroad southwest to Whitehall Road. That route became Walker Street. That sounds like an unremarkable administrative detail. It was not unremarkable if you lived there. Every new street changed movement. A new street could bring customers. It could increase land value. It could expose a previously isolated cluster of buildings to more traffic. It could also make an unruly settlement harder for city leaders to ignore. Snake Nation had flourished partly because it occupied an edge. Atlanta kept moving toward that edge. There was a basic contradiction developing. The businesses of Snake Nation benefited from Atlanta's growth, but Atlanta's growth threatened Snake Nation. The larger and wealthier the city became, the more valuable nearby land became. The more merchants invested in Atlanta, the more they demanded order. The more families arrived, the more churches and reform organizations gained influence. The more municipal government developed, the less willing officials became to accept districts that openly resisted regulation. Snake Nation needed Atlanta's customers. It did not necessarily want Atlanta's rules. Atlanta wanted Whitehall Road's trade. It increasingly did not want Snake Nation's reputation. For several years, nobody had the strength to resolve that contradiction. The city government was small. Enforcement remained weak. The rowdy political faction had significant support. Saloons were deeply embedded in political life. People who wanted stricter regulation could complain, preach, organise and vote, but they could not simply wish the district away. It is worth remembering that drinking itself was not some unusual fringe activity. Alcohol consumption was common throughout 19th century American society. Temperance movements were growing precisely because drinking was so common. A man could oppose violent saloons without opposing alcohol entirely. Another might oppose drunkenness but still drink moderately. Some reformers demanded total abstinence. Others focused more on gambling, prostitution, Sunday sales, disorder, or illegal establishments. The battle lines hardened over time. Snake Nation made those arguments physical. A minister could preach against vice on Sunday. A merchant could complain about public disorder on Monday. A city official could pass an ordinance on Tuesday. Then on Tuesday night, a drinking establishment near Whitehall Road could continue operating exactly as it had before. Rules are only powerful when someone can enforce them. Atlanta was discovering that basic fact. Suppose an officer entered a crowded establishment to arrest someone. He might be dealing with 20 men who knew one another. He might have no backup nearby. The accused man's friends might interfere. The arrest might create a larger fight than the original offence. Even if the prisoner reached jail, Atlanta's primitive detention facilities had serious weaknesses. Later accounts of the period repeatedly describe escapes and organised efforts to release imprisoned rowdies. Those problems would become especially embarrassing after the Moral Party finally gained political control. Before that showdown, however, the people associated with Snake Nation had another protection: politics. This may be the most important fact about the settlement. Snake Nation was not powerful because its residents possessed an army. It was powerful because enough people in early Atlanta tolerated, supported, profited from, or participated in the same culture. The Free and Rowdy Party drew support from saloons and from people who resisted the Moral Party's reform program. GPB's account notes that Atlanta's first three mayors were rowdy candidates: Moses Formwalt, Benjamin Bomar, and Willis Buell. 3 mayors. That means the rowdies were not standing outside city politics throwing rocks through the windows. For a time, They were city politics. Imagine being a moral party supporter watching this happen. You believe Atlanta can become an important commercial centre. Rail lines are expanding. Property values are rising. New residents are arriving. You want investment. You want stronger government. You want fewer public fights. You want gamblers controlled. You want brothels removed. Then election after election, candidates supported by the more permissive side keep winning. From your perspective, Snake Nation is not merely embarrassing, it is helping determine who runs Atlanta. Now look at the same situation from the other direction. You own a tavern. Your customers are railroad workers and wagon drivers. You make your living selling something that is legal and widely consumed. A group of wealthy merchants and religious reformers starts telling you that your business is corrupting Atlanta. They want stricter licensing. They want restrictions on drinking. They want gambling suppressed. Some want establishments like yours closed entirely. From your perspective, they are not saving the city. They are trying to take control of it and impose their standards on everyone else. This is how a disagreement about saloons becomes a political identity. People rarely fight hardest over an issue when they think only money is involved. They fight harder when the issue becomes connected to who they believe they are. The rowdy side increasingly represented personal liberty, working-class drinking culture, resistance to reformers, and the social world around the saloons. The moral side increasingly represented temperance, Protestant respectability, commercial order, and the belief that Atlanta's future depended on becoming more disciplined. Neither label tells us everything about every supporter, but the labels became useful weapons. Rowdy could be worn almost proudly. Morale could sound either admirable or self-righteous, depending on who was saying it. And Snake Nation sat in the middle of that argument. The settlement was close enough to downtown that people knew what happened there. Its drinking houses were visible, its reputation spread. Violence there became a civic issue, yet the city did not possess the simple ability to eliminate it. That is why the phrase lawless district needs to be understood carefully. Snake Nation was not beyond all law. Georgia law still existed. County authority still existed. People could still be arrested for serious crimes. What made the district appear lawless was the combination of weak institutions, rough businesses, political protection, poor housing, transient populations, and a location that complicated direct municipal control. Atlanta had laws. Atlanta did not always have the power to make people obey them. By the beginning of the 1850s, that distinction was becoming impossible to ignore. The road was changing. The town was changing. Whitehall Road was becoming Peter Street. Atlanta was growing beyond the rough settlement that had produced Snake Nation. But Snake Nation was not disappearing simply because respectable citizens wanted it to. Its saloons still had customers. Its gamblers still had money on the table. Its political allies still expected a voice in city government. And the people who wanted them controlled had started organising more seriously. One of those men had come south from New England only a few years earlier. He had built a sawmill. He had made money from the railroad. He believed Atlanta could become something larger than a rough collection of tracks, stores, shanties, and drinking houses. His name was Jonathan Norcross. The problem for Norcross was that before he could change Snake Nation, he would have to defeat the people who had been winning Atlanta's elections. And those people had given themselves a name that told him exactly what kind of fight he was entering. The Free and Rowdy Party. The Free and Rowdy Party. The name sounds like something its enemies might have invented as an insult, but Atlanta's early political world really did contain a faction remembered by that name. Its supporters were commonly called the Rowdies, and for the first few years after Atlanta became a city, they were not a powerless collection of gamblers complaining from the edge of town. They were winning elections. That point matters because it changes the way Snake Nation should be understood. It is easy to picture the settlement as a place completely separated from respectable Atlanta, almost as though the city ended and another society began on the other side of the municipal line. The reality was less convenient. People associated with Snake Nation drank in Atlanta, worked in Atlanta, traded in Atlanta, knew people in Atlanta, and participated in the political culture surrounding the city. Modern histories of Castleberry Hill identify Snake Nation as an important source of support for the free and rowdy faction. For a short period, that faction was remarkably successful. Atlanta's first mayor was a rowdy candidate. So was its second. So was its third. Before Jonathan Norcross and the Moral Party finally broke the sequence, the people who wanted a permissive, loosely regulated railroad town had repeatedly managed to put their candidates into the mayor's office. To understand how that happened, we need to forget what the word party means in modern politics. There was no national free and rowdy party with a headquarters, convention, permanent platform and candidates running across the country. Atlanta's moral and rowdy factions were local political coalitions formed around the particular arguments dividing a new city, and Atlanta had plenty to argue about. The city had been incorporated only in 1847. Its government was still being invented. Its population was growing because of the railroad. Municipal officers were trying to decide how streets should be maintained, how prisoners should be confined, how businesses should be regulated, how taxes should be collected, and how much disorder residents were willing to tolerate. The answers depended heavily on what kind of Atlanta you wanted. If you were a merchant who had invested heavily in property, you might want tighter regulation. You wanted streets that customers could use. You wanted violence controlled. You wanted visiting businessmen to believe Atlanta was stable. You might belong to a church whose minister preached against drunkenness and gambling. You might believe that the town's dozens of drinking establishments were damaging both public morality and your commercial future. Someone else could look at the same city and reach a very different conclusion. Perhaps you ran a tavern. Perhaps you worked on the railroad and expected to spend your wages as you pleased. Perhaps you owned a boarding house where your customers drank and played cards. Perhaps you sold liquor. Perhaps your livelihood depended on men who came into Atlanta with money after several days or weeks of hard physical labour. If reformers began demanding tighter licensing, reduced drinking, gambling restrictions, and greater interference in entertainment businesses, the issue would not feel theoretical. It would threaten your income. The result was a political division that early Atlanta histories described in unusually direct terms. One side organised as the Moral Party, calling for public order and reform. Its opponents became known as the Rowdy Party, or the Free and Rowdy Party, defending a more permissive approach to the saloon and gambling culture that had developed around the railroad town. The first real test came almost immediately. Atlanta held its first mayoral election in January 1848. Jonathan Norcross was already involved. So was Moses Formwalt. Norcross represented the reform-minded side. Formwalt became the candidate favoured by the rowdy interest. An early Atlanta history states that people associated with the rowdy element understood that Formwalt's victory would protect them better than a Norcross administration would. The same account says Murrell's Row, another notorious vice district in early Atlanta, supported Formwalt solidly. Moses Formwalt is worth meeting properly, because he does not fit neatly into the role of some incompetent criminal politician. He was only 27 or 28 when Atlanta chose him as its first mayor. He had moved into the area during the 1840s and worked as a tinsmith. Accounts of his business describe him making household and commercial metal goods, including copper stills used in producing liquor. He also had connections to the tavern business, which made his association with Atlanta's drinking culture more than symbolic. Yet being a rowdy did not mean Formwalt wanted Atlanta to collapse into chaos. That is an important distinction. The rowdy position was not necessarily there should be no government. It was closer to the government should not be run according to the reformers' definition of respectable behaviour. Formwalt still had streets to manage. He still had ordinances to deal with. He still had public safety problems. Atlanta was trying to construct a jail during his period in office. A government associated with the rowdies could enforce laws while remaining far more tolerant of drinking, gambling, and the businesses reformers considered immoral. That difference between tolerance and complete lawlessness gets lost easily because most surviving narratives were written after the moral party's eventual triumph. History is often written by the people who succeed in defining what respectable means. Once Atlanta became a major commercial city, it became natural for later writers to describe the early reformers as the people who saved Atlanta from its embarrassing youth. The rowdies became useful villains in that story. They certainly gave later historians plenty of material. But in 1848 the outcome was not obvious. Formwalt defeated Norcross. The rowdy interest had won Atlanta's first mayoral election. Think about what that told everyone living around Snake Nation and the other vice districts. The city could complain about them. Ministers could condemn them. Merchants could say they were damaging Atlanta's reputation. But when voters actually chose a mayor, the reform candidate lost. That creates confidence. A saloon owner who had worried that stricter rules were coming could continue operating. A gambler could reasonably assume that the new government was unlikely to make gambling suppression its defining mission. People who made money from the loose entertainment economy had evidence that they possessed political influence. Norcross and the reformers had evidence too. They had learned that respectable outrage was not enough. They needed votes. Formwalt served for 1 year. Atlanta's mayoral terms were short, which meant the argument returned almost immediately. Benjamin F. Bomar followed Formwalt as mayor for 1849. Bomar is less famous today, but his election continued the same political pattern. Modern summaries of Atlanta's early mayoral history identify him with the rowdy faction. Willis Buell followed for 1850 and is likewise identified as a rowdy mayor. 3 elections, 3 rowdy victories. For the moral faction, the situation must have been infuriating. Atlanta was growing quickly. Railroads were making the town increasingly important. Businesses were opening. Freight was moving through the city. New residents were arriving. Yet the political culture remained closely connected to the saloon world. There were more than 40 drinking establishments in a city whose population was still only a few thousand. A later account of the decisive election campaign says those establishments did extremely good business while the political battle was underway. That number is worth thinking about in practical terms. Suppose a saloon has 20 regular customers who can vote. Now suppose the owner supports a particular candidate. He does not need television advertisements. He does not need social media. He does not need a mailing list. He sees those voters repeatedly. They come through his door. They sit in his establishment. They talk politics there. They hear rumours there. They learn who is angry with whom. They find out which candidate plans to regulate their drinking place. The saloon itself becomes a campaign organisation. Early American taverns had performed political functions for generations. Meetings took place in them. Deals were made in them. News travelled through them. Atlanta's saloons inherited that role in a setting where the population was small enough that personal networks could decide an election. The free and rowdy faction therefore had something the moral party needed to overcome: daily access to voters. A man might hear one political speech from Jonathan Norcross. He could hear his bartender complain about Norcross every evening for a month. And there was another advantage: liquor. Accounts of Atlanta's rowdy politics repeatedly mentioned candidates and supporters using free drinks to attract or reward voters. By the campaign that finally brought Norcross to office, the contrast had become famous enough to survive in multiple early histories. Rowdy supporters offered whiskey and similar stimulants, while Norcross's side distributed fruit and confectionery. Apples against whiskey. Candy against saloons. It sounds almost too convenient. Yet contemporary memory preserved the contrast because it summarised the political identities of the two sides so perfectly. The moral party wanted to say, "Look at us. We are sober. We are orderly. We are respectable." The rowdies answered by continuing to behave like rowdies. Nobody needed a 20-page manifesto. You could tell which side you were standing with by what was being passed around. The campaign was not good-natured. An early history of Atlanta describes it as extremely bitter, and says fistfights involving prominent citizens were common during the contest. At night, portions of the town could appear to be under the control of loud crowds. With more than 40 saloons serving customers during the political excitement, alcohol was never far from the conflict. That gives us a better picture of what politics looked like in this city. There were no quiet lines of voters entering a modern polling station, while campaign workers remained a legally prescribed distance away. Campaigning could happen directly around the electorate, drinking and voting mixed, personal arguments mixed with political ones. Candidates were known personally to many people voting for them. Supporters could confront one another in the street. The difference between an election rally and saloon crowd could become very small. Snake Nation fitted naturally into this environment. Its residents and businesses were connected to the same loose economy that the Moral Party wanted to regulate. GPB's account of the period specifically identifies Snake Nation as an important source of free and rowdy support, and describes rowdy organisers using saloons and drinking to build loyalty. But calling this political machine democratic requires an enormous qualification. Atlanta's entire population was not deciding these elections. Women had no political voice at the polls. Enslaved black Atlantans had no vote at all. Free black people were excluded from the white political system that controlled municipal government. The electorate represented only a portion of the people whose lives would be affected by whatever the mayor decided. That matters particularly when we talk about vice districts. Women working in prostitution could become central symbols in the political argument without having any formal political power themselves. They could be discussed, regulated, arrested, driven away, used as evidence of Atlanta's supposed moral decline. They could not walk into the election and vote against the men promising to remove them. The politics of Snake Nation was therefore largely a contest among white male voters over how a much larger population should be governed. Another group existed inside this world almost without a voice in the rowdy versus moral story: enslaved people. Atlanta was a slave-holding southern city. Enslaved black workers were present in homes, businesses, construction, transportation, hotels, and other parts of the local economy. Their lives intersected constantly with the same city, whose white voters were arguing about liquor and gambling. The phrase, free and rowdy, therefore contains an uncomfortable historical contradiction. Freedom was being claimed by men who wanted freedom from certain forms of municipal regulation in a society where thousands of people across Georgia were legally enslaved. The rowdies were talking about their freedom to drink, gamble, run businesses, and resist reform. They were not proposing universal freedom. That does not make the political conflict irrelevant. It places it correctly inside its time. The argument was about which white citizens would control municipal government and what sort of behaviour that government would permit. By late 1850, the moral faction believed it had finally gathered enough support to break the rowdy hold. Norcross returned. He was older than Formwalt and had a very different public image. Jonathan Norcross had come south from New England in 1844. He operated a store and then a sawmill and profited from railroad expansion by supplying timber. He became involved in Atlanta's civic development and was identified strongly with the merchant class that wanted the settlement to become more stable, regulated, and commercially respectable. He had already lost once. This time his supporters organised much more deliberately. An early account says a mass meeting of citizens interested in good morals and public order nominated Norcross. Their opponents selected lawyer L.C. Simpson. The labels were no longer hidden behind ordinary candidate personalities. The election became an explicit contest between the Moral Party and the Rowdy Party. There is sometimes confusion about the date because the campaign and election occurred at the end of 1850, while Norcross took office in January 1851. Pioneer records state that city officials elected in December were sworn in on January 23, 1851. That is why some histories call it the election of 1850, while others describe Norcross as the mayor elected for 1851. the distinction would not have mattered much to anyone fighting in the streets. For them, the important question was whether 3 years of rowdy dominance were about to end. The Moral Party campaigned openly on the condition of Atlanta. Its speakers condemned corruption. They condemned disorder. They attacked the influence of gambling and drinking establishments. They told voters that the city needed to be taken away from the people who had made rowdyism part of its public reputation. An early Atlanta history describes moral rallies where speakers called upon the better element of the community to rescue the city from vice. That wording tells you as much about class as it does about morality. The reformers were not simply saying certain activities were harmful. They were dividing Atlanta into better people and worse people. The rowdies did not need to appreciate being described that way. Their campaign depended less on large reform meetings and more on the social world they already controlled. The saloons remained active, money circulated, whiskey circulated, arguments circulated. One surviving account says that while Simpson supporters spent freely in drinking establishments, Norcross's people deliberately handed out apples and sweets in order to emphasize the moral distinction between the campaigns. You can imagine an undecided voter walking through Atlanta during those days. At one location, someone gives him fruit and tells him the city needs law and order. At another, someone gives him whiskey and tells him Norcross wants to tell grown men how to live. Later, he hears that somebody has been punched over the election. At supper, he hears another rumour. The next morning, a newspaper attacks the rowdies. That night, the saloon crowd attacks the moralists. This was politics conducted at human distance. Everybody involved could see the other side. That made resentment much more personal. The result finally went against the rowdies. Jonathan Norcross won. Atlanta's 3-year sequence of rowdy mayors was over. For Norcross's supporters, it was proof that Atlanta had changed. The city was ready for stronger government. The merchants and reformers had finally defeated the saloon interest. The new mayor could begin enforcing the standards he had spent years advocating. That was the optimistic interpretation. There was an immediate problem with it. The rowdies had lost an election. They had not disappeared. The saloons were still there. The gamblers were still there. Murrell's Row was still there. Snake Nation was still there. The men who had spent several years believing they held political protection were not suddenly convinced that Norcross possessed moral authority because some ballots had been counted. More importantly, early Atlanta had only a tiny enforcement structure available to make them accept the result. Norcross was not entering a mayor's office with a modern police department beneath him. Pioneer records describe the mayor as carrying responsibilities that included acting as chief of police and superintendent of streets. Municipal government remained small enough that the mayor could personally preside over cases involving people accused of violating city rules. That put Norcross directly in front of the people he had spent the campaign condemning. There was no administrative distance. If a rowdy was arrested, the new mayor might be the man sitting across from him. If the mayor imposed a fine, the confrontation could happen in a room filled with the prisoner's friends. The danger was obvious almost immediately. According to Thomas H. Martin's Early History of Atlanta, rowdy supporters had already boasted that Uncle Jonathan would find Atlanta too dangerous if he attempted the reforms he had promised. Norcross received threats of physical violence. Soon after taking office, he had to hear the case of a large man arrested after a street fight. A hostile crowd gathered to watch. When Norcross found the man guilty and imposed a fine, the prisoner drew a bowie knife as officers approached him. The confrontation was stopped before the mayor was killed. But that was not the end of it. The rowdies wanted Norcross to understand that winning the election did not automatically mean controlling Atlanta. They found an old cannon. It had reportedly been kept in nearby Decatur and used for celebrations. The rowdies obtained it, hauled it into Atlanta, placed it in front of Norcross's store and pointed it toward the building. They fired it with sand and gravel rather than a destructive cannonball, leaving damage limited largely to the mess around the property. Then they left a warning that if Norcross did not resign or leave town, they could return and use the weapon more seriously. A cannon, in a mayoral dispute, only a few years after Atlanta became a city. This is why calling the Free and Rowdy Party merely a colourful political faction understates what the conflict had become. Political defeat had moved into physical intimidation. Norcross's government now had to answer a question much more difficult than winning an election. Could it actually enforce its authority? He and his council responded by calling for law-abiding citizens to organise themselves as volunteer police. Armed supporters assembled. Guards were stationed around the city. The rowdies organised too, gathering at a building on Decatur Street. For several hours, Atlanta faced the possibility of a violent confrontation between armed political factions. The threatened battle did not happen. The rowdy gathering broke up when confronted by the larger organised force supporting the new administration, and Norcross survived the immediate challenge. But the episode exposed something that would shape everything that followed. Atlanta had elected a moral mayor, yet political order still depended on armed citizens. The government had law on its side. The rowdies had numbers, taverns, personal loyalties, and years of practice operating in a city where enforcement was unreliable. Snake Nation stood just beyond the most convenient reach of municipal regulation, ready to receive people and businesses pushed away from the increasingly controlled streets closer to the centre. Norcross could defeat the rowdies at the ballot box. He could summon armed supporters. He could attempt to strengthen enforcement. What he could not do was erase overnight the social economy that had made the Free and Rowdy Party powerful in the first place. That economy had physical locations, rooms where liquor was poured, tables where money changed hands, houses where sex was sold, back rooms where cards and dice stayed active after respectable Atlanta went home. Those places had financed friendships, campaigns, grudges and political loyalty for years. And the easiest way to understand why Snake Nation mattered so much to the rowdy world is to walk past the political speeches and see what actually happened inside those establishments after dark. By the time Jonathan Norcross defeated the Free and Rowdy faction, Snake Nation already had a reputation that Atlanta's respectable citizens knew well. You did not need to live there to know what people said about it. You heard that men went there to drink. You heard that gambling houses operated there. You heard about prostitution. You heard stories about violence. You heard that people driven out of other troublesome sections of Atlanta could find another place to operate beyond the city's convenient reach. Some of those stories were exaggerated by people who wanted the district removed. Others were based on real conditions. The difficulty for us, more than 170 years later, is separating the two. The surviving record is much better at telling us what Atlanta's reformers thought about Snake Nation than it is at showing us an ordinary evening from the point of view of someone who actually lived there. One of the most detailed early histories of Atlanta was published by Thomas H. Martin in 1902, roughly half a century after the events. Martin had access to pioneer recollections and early municipal information, making his work valuable, but his language also reflects the moral judgments of his own time. He described early Atlanta's drinking resorts, gambling houses and brothels as operating openly, and portrayed the people associated with them as a threat to public order. So we need to use him carefully. He gives us important information. He does not give us an unbiased camera. The same is true of later descriptions of Snake Nation. The Castleberry Hill historical record remembers the settlement along Old Whitehall Road as a rough shanty district where drinking houses, gambling, prostitution and serious crime were common during the 1840s and early 1850s. That gives us the framework. What it does not give us is a complete list of every saloon keeper, every gambler, every woman working in a brothel, every labourer renting a room, and every family living nearby. Those people mostly disappear from the record. To understand their world, the best approach is to begin with the business that connected nearly everything else. The saloon. A saloon in early Atlanta was not simply a 19th century version of a modern bar. It could serve several functions at once. You went there to drink, certainly, but you might also go because someone you needed to find was likely to be there. Railroad workers gathered in drinking places. Wagon drivers stopped in them. Travellers used them. Political discussions happened in them. Bets were arranged in them. Men looking for temporary work could hear about opportunities there. News moved rapidly through rooms where the same customers returned day after day. During an election, the saloon could become a political headquarters without anybody formally calling it one. During an argument, it could become a fighting ground. And in a settlement such as Snake Nation, a drinking establishment could exist beside gambling and prostitution, closely enough that the businesses fed one another. A man arrived intending to buy whiskey. He stayed for a card game, he lost money, he borrowed more. Perhaps he wandered to another house afterward. Perhaps he returned to the saloon angry. Perhaps nothing happened at all and he simply walked home drunk. The historical record naturally remembers the occasions when something went wrong. That can distort our picture. If 100 men drank without fighting, and the 101st stabbed someone, the stabbing was what people remembered. Still, early Atlanta had enough alcohol-related disorder for city authorities to treat it as a genuine problem. Martin's description of the nearby Murrells Row district says drinking establishments were extremely common there, and drunken fights occurred with remarkable frequency. He remembered Saturday nights when fights became large enough to resemble riots. Murrells Row was not Snake Nation. That distinction is important. Murrells Row lay inside the early city around Decatur Street, while Snake Nation was associated with the Whitehall Road area, farther south and west. We should not automatically take every detailed story from Murrells Row and relocate it into Snake Nation merely because both had bad reputations, but the two districts belong to the same early Atlanta vice economy. In fact, Martin specifically says that after the Norcross administration began imposing greater order inside the city, some of the worst characters from Murrells Row moved towards Snake Nation and Slab Town, which were outside the municipal limits and therefore beyond the direct reach of Atlanta's city regulations. That movement tells us a great deal. Snake Nation was not simply a place where vice happened by accident. Its location made vice easier to sustain. If a city official made life difficult for a gambling operator inside Atlanta, the operator did not necessarily need to abandon his customers. He could move a short distance. Atlanta's people would still come to him. Atlanta's money would still come to him. But Atlanta's municipal officers would have fewer tools available once he crossed the boundary. A customer did not care much about that legal distinction. If the walk was manageable, the business remained accessible. That is why the phrase outside the city can be misleading. Snake Nation was outside Atlanta in a legal sense. It was not isolated from Atlanta in an economic or social sense. The railroad town supplied its customers. The district supplied the railroad town with entertainment Atlanta's reformers increasingly wanted controlled. Alcohol was only the beginning. Gambling fitted naturally into this environment because early Atlanta had many men earning wages in cash, and many newcomers who had few established social connections. Some games required almost nothing: cards, dice, a table, money. Other forms of betting involved public spectacles. Martin's history describes cockfighting as a major amusement in Murrells Row, with several cockpits and crowds that could reach into the hundreds. The rough wooden buildings there also contained games of chance and establishments that he described as little more than places for robbery. Modern Castleberry Hill histories include cockfighting among the activities associated with the Snake Nation era as well. It is easy to underestimate how much gambling depended on trust. You sat down with money. Someone dealt the cards. Someone kept track of the stakes. Someone decided whether a game was fair. If the establishment itself was dishonest, a newcomer could be cheated before we realised what was happening. A professional gambler had advantages over a railroad labourer who played occasionally. A group working together had even greater advantages. One man could encourage the victim, another could play, another could watch the door, another could lend money after the victim lost his own. Confidence games flourished in places where strangers continually arrived, because the same trick could be used again on someone who had never heard about it. Martin remembered confidence men operating successfully around Murrells Row. another indication that Atlanta's transient population created opportunities for fraud as well as ordinary gambling. The railroad was essential to this. Imagine the difference between cheating someone in a farming community and cheating someone in a railroad junction. In the farming community, word spreads. People know one another. The victim returns, his relatives return. Your reputation becomes a problem. At a transportation hub, tomorrow brings someone new. A train comes in. Passengers step off. A wagon arrives. A salesman needs a room. A labourer receives wages. A man heading somewhere else has one night to spend in Atlanta. He does not know which establishment has a bad reputation. He may not even care. He expects to leave in the morning. That creates a perfect market for businesses that depend on strangers making quick decisions. It also explains why Atlanta's respectable merchants worried so much about the city's reputation. They were competing for some of the same strangers. A merchant wanted the traveller to spend money in his store. A hotel owner wanted him to rent a room. A gambler wanted him at the card table. A saloon keeper wanted him drinking. A sex worker needed customers too. Everyone was living from the traffic created by the same railroad economy. The disagreement was over which kinds of business Atlanta wanted associated with its future. Prostitution sat at the centre of that disagreement, yet it is the part of Snake Nation that the records handle least fairly. Historical summaries repeatedly identify brothels and prostitutes with Snake Nation. GPB describes the district as part of Atlanta's early red light world, and local neighbourhood histories likewise include brothels among the businesses common there. But the women themselves are rarely allowed to speak. That should make us cautious whenever an old history describes them. Martin eventually writes about the women removed from Snake Nation, using contemptuous language typical of 19th and early 20th century moral reform writing. His interest is not in asking why a woman entered prostitution, how much money she earned, whether she worked independently, whether someone controlled her, whether she had children, or whether she had another realistic way to support herself. To the reform story, she is evidence that Snake Nation is immoral. Then, when the district is attacked, she becomes part of the population to be removed. Her individual life vanishes. That absence is especially important in a railroad boomtown. Women had fewer economic opportunities than men. Wages for respectable female employment were limited, legal rights were restricted, and women without family support could become extremely vulnerable. Prostitution could involve coercion, exploitation, poverty, personal choice under narrow circumstances, or some combination of all of those things. We cannot responsibly invent a single explanation for every woman in Snake Nation, because the sources do not give us one. We can say that prostitution existed there. We can say that reformers regarded it as a major part of the district's vice economy. We cannot pretend we possess the personal histories of the women whose lives became part of the legend. That difference matters because later retellings can make Snake Nation sound entertaining. Bootleggers, gamblers, snake oil sellers, prostitutes, fighters. A neighbourhood full of colourful characters makes a good story. Living there would have been much less amusing. If violence was common, poorer residents could not simply move into a safer neighbourhood whenever trouble began. If a woman was being exploited, there was no modern social service system waiting for her. If someone stole your wages in a gambling room, your legal remedies were weak. If you were assaulted, finding an officer did not guarantee that the offender would remain confined. Atlanta's early jail became famous for exactly the opposite reason. Martin describes the first small lockup as so insecure that prisoners burrowed out, overturned the structure, or escaped after friends lifted it from its foundation. The city eventually had to construct a stronger jail. The story is funny until you consider what it means. Suppose someone threatens you. He gets arrested. You watch him go to jail. Then you see him again the next day because his friends helped him escape. How much confidence do you have in the law after that? This problem was larger than the jail, law enforcement depended heavily on a small number of local officers operating in a town filled with armed men. There was no rapid system for calling reinforcements. There was no radio. There was no professional detective bureau capable of following a transient suspect across several states. There was no standardized identification system. If a man committed a crime and left Atlanta, authorities might have little more than his name and a physical description, assuming either one was accurate. For a district with many temporary residents and visitors, that made enforcement difficult even when officials genuinely wanted to enforce the law. Snake Nation added the jurisdictional problem on top of everything else. Martin's later account states plainly that Snake Nation and Slabtown were just outside Atlanta's boundaries and therefore could not be brought under the same municipal regulations used within the city. State law still applied, county authority still existed. Murder did not become legal because someone crossed Whitehall Road, but the daily offences reformers cared about could be much harder to suppress. Drinking, disorderly establishments, gambling, prostitution, public disturbances. The kinds of violations that depend on repeated local enforcement are exactly the kinds of violations that flourish when the responsible authority is weak, distant, divided, or unwilling to act. This helps explain why saloons became so central. A saloon created a permanent gathering point. The owner had an interest in protecting customers from interference. Regular customers had an interest in protecting the owner. Gamblers could work from the same place or nearby. Sex workers could find customers there. Political organisers could find voters there. Men wanted by city officials could hear warnings there. The business produced a network. That network was far more difficult to eliminate than one criminal working alone. Nor should we imagine that the atmosphere was violent every minute. That would make no economic sense. A saloon where every customer was immediately robbed or beaten would lose customers quickly. Most evenings probably included long stretches of ordinary drinking and conversation. Men talked about work, railroad schedules, money, politics, weather, people arriving in town, people leaving town. Someone told a story everybody had already heard. Someone complained about a foreman. Someone argued about an election. Cards were dealt. Money moved from one hand to another. A customer became louder after his third drink. Another man told him to settle down. Then, on some nights, the ordinary sequence broke. An accusation of cheating, a debt, an insult, a disagreement over politics, a woman, a previous grudge, a pistol visible beneath a coat, a knife drawn too quickly. Martin records Atlanta's first homicide as occurring in 1848, when a man named McWilliams was stabbed and killed by Bill Terrell, who escaped. His account places the event in the wider context of the city's rough early social conditions. We should not turn one killing into proof that everyone in Atlanta feared for his life every evening. It does show that the violence reformers complained about was not entirely imaginary. Another part of Snake Nation's reputation involved itinerant medicine sellers. Modern accounts sometimes describe literal snake oil peddlers living or working around the district and suggest that they may have contributed to its name. Other explanations say the name referred more generally to the character people attributed to its residents. The evidence is not strong enough to settle the origin with confidence. A travelling medicine seller belonged naturally in a place like Atlanta. Medical regulation was limited by modern standards. Patent medicines could be advertised with extravagant claims. A seller might promise relief from pain, stomach trouble, weakness, rheumatism, or almost anything else likely to bother a paying customer. Some preparations contained ingredients capable of producing noticeable effects. Alcohol itself appeared in many patent remedies. Other products accomplished very little. The sales method depended heavily on performance. Get attention, tell a convincing story, describe the illness, describe the cure, produce testimonials, sell the bottle, move on. Atlanta's constant flow of travellers provided customers who might never see the seller again. This placed the medicine peddler somewhere between commerce and entertainment, which made him a natural addition to the mythology surrounding Snake Nation. The larger point is that the district made money from immediacy. Drink now, bet now, buy now, pay now. The customer might be gone tomorrow. That kind of economy encourages short-term relationships. Respectable Atlanta was trying to build the opposite kind of economy. Buy property, construct a store, build a warehouse, establish credit, raise a family, join a church, invest in a railroad, stay. The conflict between Snake Nation and the Moral Party was partly a conflict between those two economic cultures. Not everyone fits neatly into either category, but the difference helps explain why merchants and churchmen reacted so strongly. A saloon could make money from Atlanta's growth without caring whether Atlanta became respectable. A gambler could make money from railroad traffic without investing anything in the city's long-term stability. A brothel could serve visitors brought by commerce, while becoming exactly the kind of establishment commercial boosters did not want visitors associating with Atlanta. The same transportation boom created both sides. This is why the reform movement kept returning to the issue. Snake Nation was not an isolated pocket of bad behaviour that could simply be ignored. It was attached to Atlanta's economic bloodstream. Customers moved back and forth. Money moved back and forth. Political influence moved back and forth. When the Free and Rowdy faction controlled city government, that relationship remained manageable for the people who operated vice businesses. Then Jonathan Norcross won. His election altered the balance. The new administration began imposing more discipline inside the municipal limits. The confrontation with rowdy supporters, including threats against Norcross and the famous Cannon episode, demonstrated how strongly some people resisted the change. Once volunteer police and the new government gained control of the central city, the rowdy network did not simply vanish. Martin says people from Murrell's Row withdrew towards Snake Nation and Slab Town, where municipal regulation could not follow them as easily. That changed Snake Nation. The settlement was no longer merely one of several rough places around Atlanta. It became a refuge for activities the new administration was trying to suppress. To Norcross and his supporters, that made the district intolerable. They could stand inside Atlanta and claim that the streets were becoming safer. Then they could look just beyond the city line and see establishments they believed were continuing the same drinking, gambling, prostitution, and disorder they had campaigned against. Legal jurisdiction had created an absurd situation from their point of view. The behaviour they wanted stopped had moved a short distance rather than disappearing. People could walk there, spend money, drink, gamble, return to Atlanta. The city had solved only part of the problem. Norcross's supporters now faced a choice. They could accept the limits of municipal authority and rely on county or state enforcement. They could attempt to expand the city's legal reach through ordinary political methods. They could continue pressuring the district gradually, or they could decide that formal law was moving too slowly. That final option is where the history of Snake Nation becomes uncomfortable. The same citizens who had spent years demanding law and order began discussing a solution that did not depend on ordinary law. They had defeated the rowdies in an election. They had faced down armed resistance. They had strengthened control inside Atlanta. Yet Snake Nation remained. Its saloons still had customers. Money still crossed the city line. Gambling continued. Prostitution continued. People driven out of Murrell's Row had somewhere else to go. The Moral Party had finally gained political power, and now its supporters were beginning to discover that political power alone might not give them the result they wanted. Winning the election did not give Jonathan Norcross what he actually needed. It gave him an office. What he needed was obedience. Those were not the same thing in Atlanta in 1851. Norcross had defeated L.C. Simpson, and the political faction remembered as the Rowdy Party, after an unusually bitter campaign. The Moral Party had finally broken the control enjoyed by rowdy candidates during Atlanta's first years as an incorporated city. Early histories describe the contest as one between citizens calling for stronger public order and opponents connected closely with the drinking and gambling culture of the young railroad town. Norcross's supporters emphasised reform, while Simpson's supporters were associated with the city's many saloons. For Norcross and the people who backed him, the election result was supposed to mark a change in Atlanta. They had spent several years watching the settlement grow faster than its government. The population had expanded, railroad traffic had expanded, businesses had expanded, saloons had expanded, gambling houses and brothels had become well established. Street fights were common enough to become part of Atlanta's early reputation, and the city possessed only a small municipal structure with which to handle them. Norcross had been in Atlanta long enough to watch this happen. He was not a newcomer arriving after the city had already been built. He had come in 1844 before Atlanta had even received its city charter. Pioneer accounts say he opened a general store and then operated a sawmill supplying railroad construction, with cross ties and timber. He belonged to the group of merchants and property holders whose fortunes increased as the railroad town expanded. That background helps explain his politics. A man whose business depended on Atlanta becoming a successful transportation and commercial centre had reasons to care about more than personal morality. Violence was bad for business. Unreliable law enforcement was bad for business. A town known primarily for drinking, gambling, prostitution and street disorder was not the image merchants wanted presented to potential investors and permanent residents. Norcross also had strong personal views about temperance and public behaviour, and the moral party included people who regarded alcohol and vice as genuine moral dangers. But commercial self-interest and moral reform pointed in the same direction. They wanted a more controlled city. The problem was that a large part of Atlanta had grown accustomed to something else. The rowdy faction had not disappeared simply because its candidate lost. The saloons were still open, their customers were still there, the gamblers were still playing, the people who had supported rowdy candidates still knew one another, still gathered in the same establishments, and still resented the men who had just announced that Atlanta required cleaning up. Snake Nation remained close to the city. Murrell's Row remained notorious inside it. Other rough settlements and drinking places continued to operate. Atlanta had changed its mayor without changing its population. Norcross therefore entered office with an unusual concentration of responsibilities. The municipal government was tiny by modern standards. Pioneer accounts of his administration state that the mayor was not merely the ceremonial head of the city. Norcross also acted as chief of police and superintendent of streets. There was no separate municipal recorder to handle the ordinary police court, so the mayor himself could preside when people were brought in for violations. Consider what that meant. The man who had spent the campaign promising to control the rowdies could personally sit in judgment when a rowdy was arrested. There was no large judicial system creating distance between politician and offender. The conflict could become face-to-face. Norcross might have helped write or enforce the policy. An officer could arrest someone under that policy. Then the same mayor could hear the case. For supporters, this meant strong leadership. For enemies, it made Norcross personally responsible for everything they disliked about the new government. Threats began almost immediately. Thomas H. Martin's Early History of Atlanta, published in 1902 using pioneer testimony and older records, says some of the most aggressive rowdies had boasted before Norcross took office that they would make the town too dangerous for him if he attempted to carry out his reforms. Norcross also received direct threats of violence. This was not ordinary post-election irritation. The rowdy faction had controlled the mayor's office during Atlanta's first 3 administrations. Now, men who had expected municipal government to tolerate their social world were being told that the same government would be used against it. Norcross had to establish authority quickly. If he hesitated, the rowdies would learn that his campaign promises had been political theatre. If he moved aggressively, he risked provoking exactly the confrontation his opponents had promised. Within days, he received his first serious test. A large man had been arrested after a street fight. Martin's account describes him as a known rough character. The charge itself was ordinary enough for early Atlanta, an affray in the street. What made the case dangerous was the crowd expected to attend. Rumours circulated that rowdy supporters planned to intimidate the new mayor. Some accounts suggested men might deliberately get themselves arrested in order to confront him while court was in session. Atlanta's municipal government was then operating from an upstairs room rather than a purpose-built civic complex. When Norcross began hearing the case, a large crowd gathered. Many of the spectators were hostile to him. The evidence against the prisoner was strong. Norcross found him guilty and imposed a fine. That should have ended the matter. It did not. As officers approached to take the man away, he stood and pulled a Bowie knife. Martin described the blade as roughly a foot long. A Bowie knife was not a small pocket knife. In an enclosed room, at close distance, it was a serious weapon. The prisoner had produced it within reach of the mayor while many of his supporters were watching. Sheriff Johnson and another man identified as strong seized him before he could use it effectively. The crowd did not rush forward to rescue him. For a moment, the authority of the new government held. Then the officers tried to move the prisoner downstairs. Darkness had fallen. People were packed around the building. In the confusion outside, he escaped. According to Martin, he was never seen in Atlanta again. For Norcross, that was both a victory and a warning. He had refused to be intimidated. He had imposed the sentence. His officers had prevented an attack, but the prisoner had still escaped. Atlanta had a mayor prepared to enforce the law. It did not yet have an enforcement system capable of guaranteeing that the law meant very much after he issued a judgment. The incident spread through town. Business slowed as people discussed what might happen next. Men gathered in groups. The rowdy faction was angry. Moral Party supporters expected retaliation. According to Martin, some frightened citizens considered leaving Atlanta temporarily because they believed serious violence could follow. Other residents discussed forming a vigilance organisation if the existing municipal force proved incapable of handling the situation. That last idea is important. The Moral Party had campaigned in the name of law and order. Within days of taking office, some of its supporters were already discussing the possibility that ordinary city law enforcement might not be enough. This tension would define the campaign against the rowdies. Norcross wanted government authority strengthened. But because government authority was weak, he repeatedly needed private citizens to help strengthen it. The line between police enforcement and organised civilian force became thin. Nobody involved would have found that contradiction as unusual as we do. American towns in this period commonly relied on posses, volunteer patrols, militias, and citizens summoned to assist officers. Atlanta had neither the personnel nor the institutions of a mature city. Still, there is a difference between calling citizens to assist lawful officers and allowing citizens to decide for themselves who deserves punishment. Atlanta was moving toward that boundary. Norcross's first response was to demonstrate that the new administration would not retreat. The city council supported him. Moral Party activists remained organised. Merchants, property owners, temperance supporters, and other men who had voted for reform understood that Norcross could not survive politically if the rowdies frightened him into resignation. They had spent years saying Atlanta required stronger government. Now they had to prove they were willing to defend that government. The mayor began pushing enforcement more aggressively. The target was not simply drunkenness. Atlanta's reform movement opposed an interconnected culture of gambling houses, disorderly saloons, prostitution, street fighting, and businesses whose owners treated municipal regulations as optional. Murrell's Row was especially troublesome because it stood within Atlanta and therefore challenged the authority of the city directly. Snake Nation presented a different problem because it lay outside the convenient reach of municipal ordinances. Norcross could attack the first problem with city authority. The second would be harder. This distinction shaped what happened next. Inside the city limits, offenders could be arrested. They could be brought before the mayor. They could be fined. They could be jailed. Drinking establishments could be subjected to municipal rules. Officers could patrol streets where crowds had previously acted with little fear of interruption. The reformers wanted repeated enforcement to make the old rowdy culture more difficult to sustain. Norcross's importance was not that he personally invented these ideas. It was that supporters believed he possessed enough determination to keep applying them after resistance appeared. An early history written by John R. Hornady later described the 1850 election as the decisive moment when Atlanta's constructive element defeated its loose element, and said the influence of the gambling and drinking class declined afterward. The language is openly favourable to the reformers, but it reflects the way Atlanta's respectable civic memory eventually interpreted Norcross's victory. The people being targeted did not share that interpretation. To them, this could look less like the arrival of good government and more like one political faction using power to punish the businesses and habits of another. Temperance was especially controversial because alcohol was woven deeply into ordinary 19th century life. Whiskey was not confined to criminals. Respectable people drank too. Alcohol could be served at public gatherings, hotels, taverns, and social events. The temperance movement was becoming stronger, but it was fighting against a culture in which drinking was normal for large numbers of men. The moral party therefore had to distinguish between ordinary citizens who drank and the public disorder its leaders blamed on Atlanta's saloon economy. In practice, that distinction could become political very quickly. A saloon owner who had actively supported Simpson was unlikely to believe that enforcement against his business had nothing to do with politics. A rowdy voter arrested after a fight could easily conclude that Norcross was using the police court against enemies. Every fine fed resentment. Every arrest could create another confrontation. Every attempt to shut down disorderly activity pushed some of it somewhere else. That last consequence mattered most for Snake Nation. Martin's history states that as the Norcross administration gained control over the rougher areas inside Atlanta, some of the people associated with Murrell's Row moved outside the city towards Snake Nation and Slab Town. There, the same municipal regulations could not be applied so easily. This was an unintended effect of successful enforcement. Clean up one street, the problem moves. Close one establishment, another opens beyond the boundary. Arrest gamblers downtown. They find a table outside town. Make Atlanta's central streets uncomfortable for prostitutes and their customers. Business shifts toward a settlement where Atlanta's mayor has less authority. The moral party was not merely fighting individual offenders, it was squeezing a market. The market adjusted. Snake Nation became more important precisely because Norcross was becoming more effective inside Atlanta. People who wanted drinking, gambling, or prostitution did not lose those desires when an ordinance changed. They walked farther. The businesses followed the customers. This is a recurring problem in the history of vice regulation. A government can reduce an activity in one jurisdiction without eliminating the demand that supports it. Norcross did not have to understand that as an economic theory. He could watch it happening. He could make the central city more orderly, and then hear that the same people were operating just beyond his reach. For his supporters, this was infuriating. They had won the election. They had taken the mayor's office. They had accepted the risk of confronting the rowdies. Yet from certain streets in Atlanta, residents could travel a short distance and find much of what the moral party claimed to have defeated. Norcross also faced a practical problem with detention. Arresting men was useful only if the city could hold them. Atlanta's early jail arrangements were primitive. Martin's history recounts multiple escapes from the first small lockup and describes prisoners or their allies exploiting its weak construction. The city eventually needed more secure confinement because the original structure did not reliably perform the most basic function of a jail. That weakness gave the rowdies another reason not to fear arrest as much as Norcross wanted them to. Imagine the sequence from their side. You are arrested. Your friends know where you are. The building holding you is crude. The city has only a small number of officers. A crowd can gather quickly. If enough men are willing to help, confinement may be temporary. Law becomes a negotiation between whoever has the greater physical force at that particular moment. That was exactly the situation Norcross wanted to end. For municipal government to mean anything, a lawful arrest had to remain an arrest. A sentence had to remain a sentence. A prisoner could not simply walk away because his friends outnumbered the officers. The mayor therefore needed more manpower than the official force could provide. The confrontation after his first police court case forced the issue. According to Martin, the rowdies escalated by obtaining an old cannon from Decatur. It was a small piece of artillery associated with celebrations, reportedly a relic dating back to the War of 1812. They brought it into Atlanta and positioned it outside Norcross's store. The weapon was not loaded with a cannonball. Sand, dirt, or gravel was used depending on the account. The rowdies fired it anyway. The blast itself was the message. They also left a warning demanding that Norcross resign or leave Atlanta. If he refused, they threatened to return and use the cannon in a way that would destroy his store. At that moment, the fight stopped being mainly about liquor licenses, gambling rooms, or street disorder. An organised group was attempting to intimidate the elected mayor into abandoning office. Norcross had two choices. He could back down, or he could demonstrate that the moral party could put more armed men into Atlanta's streets than the rowdies could. He chose the second. The city council met. Norcross issued a public call for law-abiding citizens to organise themselves as a volunteer police force and assist municipal officials in enforcing local law. Men responded with guns and pistols. Martin says they assembled near Norcross's store while organisers divided them into groups and prepared patrols for the expected confrontation. This was the moment when the moral party stopped behaving merely like an election organisation. It became an armed civic force. Its supporters would have rejected the idea that they were forming a private army. In their view, they were defending legal government against people threatening rebellion. The distinction mattered to them. The mayor had issued the call. The council supported him. The armed volunteers were supposed to assist the law rather than replace it. But Atlanta now had political opponents gathering under arms on the same streets. The rowdies organised as well. Martin places one of their main gatherings in a house on Decatur Street. Moral Party volunteers guarded important points around town while other squads prepared to move against locations where rowdy supporters were known to gather. Nobody could be certain whether the night would end in gunfire. Atlanta had only recently become a city. Now one political faction was armed in defence of the mayor while another had already dragged artillery into the dispute. Norcross had wanted to prove that municipal government could control disorder. For several hours, the effort to establish control threatened to produce something much larger. The rowdies eventually lost their nerve. The cannon was not fired again at Norcross's property. Armed volunteers moved against their meeting places. Some rowdy supporters fled. Others were arrested. Martin says approximately 15 or 20 ringleaders remained too long at their Decatur Street headquarters and found themselves surrounded before they could escape. They surrendered without the major battle many residents had feared. Their cases were heard the following day. Crowds filled the area around the city government. The arrested men were convicted and fined as heavily as the charter permitted. Those unable or unwilling to pay were ordered confined. The volunteer force remained active for a period afterward because city leaders did not assume the danger had passed simply because one group had surrendered. Norcross had won the immediate confrontation. He had refused the threat. He had mobilised supporters. He had arrested ringleaders. He had demonstrated that the elected government could gather greater force than the men trying to overthrow it. Atlanta's later civic histories treated this as the breaking of the rowdy rebellion. That description is understandable. It is also incomplete. The moral party had proven it could control Atlanta's streets when enough armed supporters answered the mayor's call. It had not solved the problem of where the rowdies went afterward. Some disappeared from the city. Some moderated their behaviour. Some remained angry but accepted the new balance of power. Others moved their activities toward places where Norcross's municipal authority weakened. Snake Nation was waiting for them. So was Slab Town. From the reformers' perspective, the campaign had created an irritating result. Atlanta itself could be patrolled more effectively. the mayor could enforce ordinances more confidently. The most openly defiant rowdy leaders had learned that threatening Norcross could end with armed citizens surrounding their headquarters. Then the reformers looked toward the outskirts and saw drinking houses, prostitution, gambling, and people driven out of the central city continuing their business almost within sight of Atlanta. Martin states directly that the worst characters from Murrell's Row moved towards Snake Nation and Slabtown and continued their activities outside the reach of the city's ordinary regulations. His account is heavily moralistic, but the jurisdictional problem it describes is clear. This put the moral party in a position that should have made men committed to law and order extremely uncomfortable. They had used legal elections, they had used municipal courts, they had used fines, they had used arrests, they had used volunteer police operating under the mayor's authority. And Snake Nation remained. Norcross could not simply order Atlanta's officers to enforce every municipal rule beyond Atlanta's legal boundary as though the line did not exist. The county and state still had laws there, particularly against serious crimes, but the city could not regulate the settlement in the same direct way it regulated businesses inside its own jurisdiction. The reformers had discovered the limit of their victory. They controlled the city. They did not control everything connected to the city. For a time, the pressure continued through ordinary means. The Norcross administration maintained order more aggressively than its predecessors. The rowdy faction ceased to dominate Atlanta politics in the way it had before. Later historians consistently treated his administration as an important point in the development of municipal authority. Yet resentment did not vanish. Norcross continued receiving anonymous threats. Prisoners still had friends. Vice districts still had customers. Atlanta's official police resources remained small. And the more successful the moral party became at pushing disorder outward, the more Snake Nation came to represent the one thing its supporters could not easily reach. There was also a dangerous lesson hidden inside Norcross's success. The mayor had faced a crisis. The ordinary police force had been inadequate. He called armed citizens into the street. It worked. The rowdies backed down. That result could encourage people to believe that organised citizens were sometimes more effective than slow legal machinery. Used under official authority to prevent an attack, that belief had helped preserve Norcross's government. Used without official authority against a community people disliked, the same belief could become vigilantism. And some of the men who had just carried guns in defence of law and order were beginning to ask why they should continue tolerating Snake Nation, simply because it happened to sit on the wrong side of Atlanta's municipal boundary. Before that question was answered, Atlanta still had to get through the immediate consequences of the rowdy confrontation. Prisoners had to be kept locked up, crowds had to be controlled, threats had to be taken seriously. The cannon had shown how quickly political intimidation could become armed confrontation. The primitive jail showed how easily an arrest could become an escape. And for a city that had just elected a mayor promising control, the next weeks would demonstrate how little control Atlanta sometimes possessed. The problem with Atlanta's victory over the rowdies was that the city still had to prove it could control them. Jonathan Norcross had won the mayor's office, but early Atlanta did not possess the kind of government that could turn an election result into immediate control of the streets. The municipality was only a few years old. Its police resources were tiny. Its detention facilities were primitive. The mayor himself performed duties that would later be divided among several officials. Norcross served not only as mayor but also as chief of police, police judge, street superintendent, and something close to a general administrator whenever the young city needed one. That arrangement worked reasonably well when people accepted municipal authority. The trouble came when they did not. Atlanta had spent its first years tolerating a level of public disorder that later city leaders found embarrassing. Drinking houses were common. Gambling was well established. Men fought in the streets. In Murrell's Row, the notorious district along Decatur Street, an early history described Saturday night fights large enough to resemble riots. The same account remembered grog shops appearing in nearly every other building and gambling rooms operating in rough wooden shanties. Snake Nation was not the same place as Murrell's Row, and that distinction matters. Murrell's Row was inside Atlanta. Snake Nation stood beyond the early municipal limits along the Whitehall Road area. But the two places were connected socially and politically. Both belonged to the loose drinking, gambling and entertainment world that had supported the rowdy faction. When Norcross began making life more difficult for that culture inside Atlanta, some of the people associated with Murrell's Row shifted their activities towards Snake Nation and Slab Town, where city ordinances were harder to enforce. Before that movement could become the next major problem, Norcross had to deal with disorder in the city itself. One of the clearest signs of Atlanta's weakness was its jail. Calling it a jail may give you the wrong picture. Do not imagine a brick building with barred corridors, locked steel doors, guards working shifts, and separate cells. Early Atlanta used a small wooden calaboose, essentially a crude local lockup. Thomas Martin's history placed one such structure at Alabama and Pryor Streets, and described it as a flimsy building that was regularly filled with offenders from the rougher parts of town. The problem was that the prisoners did not always remain prisoners. Sometimes they dug their way out. Sometimes, according to the same early account, they simply used their combined strength to overturn the structure, and on one occasion, after a general disturbance had packed the lockup with rowdies, their friends arrived during the night and did something that sounds so ridiculous that it would be easy to dismiss if the episode had not survived in Atlanta's early historical record. They lifted the jail. Not the door, not a loose board. The building. The wooden structure was raised from its foundation far enough for the prisoners inside to crawl underneath and escape. A pioneer recollection preserved by Martin tells a similar story from the Norcross period. In that version, friends of an arrested gambler obtained a lever and raised the log structure enough for their companion to get out. The details differ slightly between recollections, which is normal when events are recorded decades later, but the underlying point is consistent. Early Atlanta's detention system was weak enough that determined prisoners and their friends could physically defeat it. That is worth considering from the position of a city official. You arrest someone for disorderly conduct. You bring him before the court. You impose a fine. He refuses or cannot pay. You lock him up. His friends come after dark and lift the building until he crawls out. Then he goes back to the same neighbourhood where you arrested him. At that point, the question is no longer whether Atlanta has laws. The city clearly had laws. The question is whether anyone who does not respect those laws has a reason to fear them. Norcross intended to give them one. This was why his first confrontations mattered so much. If the new Moral Party administration appeared weak, every saloon keeper, gambler and rowdy organiser would learn the same lesson. Norcross could make speeches, but daily life would continue exactly as before. One arrested man decided to test that assumption directly. The details come from early Atlanta histories that strongly favoured Norcross, so their descriptions of the accused man are openly hostile. What is supported across the accounts is that he had been arrested after causing serious public trouble and was brought before the new mayor. A hostile crowd gathered to watch the hearing. Norcross heard the evidence, found the man guilty and ordered him punished. The prisoner did not accept the decision quietly. As officers moved toward him, he produced a bowie knife. Martin described the blade as approximately a foot long. The man reportedly defied anyone in the room to take him into custody. Officers and another man in the room rushed him before he could seriously injure Norcross, and a struggle followed. They eventually subdued him. Then they tried to take him outside. It had become dark while the hearing was underway. A crowd filled the area. In the confusion, the prisoner escaped. Norcross had just held a court proceeding, issued a lawful judgment, survived the appearance of a large knife in his courtroom, and watched the convicted man disappear before he could be securely confined. It was difficult to imagine a clearer demonstration of the city's problem. The rowdies saw it too. Within roughly 48 hours, according to two early histories, the confrontation escalated again. Rowdy supporters obtained a small cannon from Decatur and dragged it into Atlanta. They positioned it in front of the general store operated by Norcross. There was something almost absurd about the weapon being there. Atlanta was not at war. There was no invading army. No enemy soldiers were approaching the railroad depot. The cannon had been brought into the street because a group of local men wanted the mayor to resign. They loaded it. The early accounts say dirt, sand, gravel, or similar material was placed in front of a heavy powder charge rather than a conventional cannonball. The exact description varies, but the purpose of the first shot seems to have been intimidation more than destruction. They fired. The blast was loud enough to alarm the town. Norcross's store was not blown apart, but that was never the entire point. The men responsible followed the demonstration with a warning: resign and leave Atlanta, or the cannon could be used again with more destructive ammunition. A modern Georgia public broadcasting account summarizes the period after Norcross's victory as bringing violent protests and disorder from Rowdy and Snake Nation supporters. The older histories tend to call the crisis a rebellion, or describe a period of intense unrest rather than give us a precise list of separate riots. What they agree on is that the mayor's opponents were attempting to show that the new administration could not safely govern Atlanta. The cannon made that challenge public. There was no easy way for Norcross to ignore it. If he resigned, the Moral Party experiment was finished. Every future mayor would know that an armed crowd could remove him. If he remained in office but did nothing, the threat would still stand. The only practical response was to demonstrate that the city could assemble more force than the Rowdies. Norcross and the council issued a call for citizens to assist the government. Men responded armed with guns and pistols. This volunteer force was organised into patrols and squads. Martin says at least 100 Moral Party supporters guarded the area around Norcross's store, and that additional patrols were positioned across town. The language used in the surviving accounts can make this sound cleaner than it really was. They called these men volunteer police. That was how Norcross and his supporters understood them. The mayor and council had called them out in defence of municipal authority, so in their view, they were not a mob. They were citizens helping the lawful government suppress armed resistance. But physically, the scene was simple. One political faction had guns. The other political faction had guns. A cannon stood in the street. Atlanta was waiting to discover whether someone would fire first. The Rowdies gathered at their own locations, including a building on Decatur Street that the early histories describe as one of their headquarters. They had talked aggressively about resisting the moral administration, and they had already shown themselves willing to threaten Norcross. The moral volunteers waited. Hours passed. The cannon remained where the Rowdies had left it. Norcross did not leave town. The threatened second attack did not come. Around midnight, the city's volunteer force began moving. A squad under A.W. Mitchell was sent toward the Rowdy headquarters on Decatur Street. Other groups moved toward places where opponents of the administration were believed to be gathering. The battle many people had feared never happened. Once the Rowdies understood how many armed citizens the administration had assembled, most dispersed. This is an important point because the later legend can make the confrontation sound like a prolonged street war. The evidence supports a serious armed crisis. It supports threats, violent disorder, a cannon, an attempted knife attack, armed political mobilization, arrests, and fear of open fighting. It does not support inventing a major pitched battle that did not happen. The Rowdy movement collapsed when confronted by a larger organised force. Not everyone escaped. Martin says roughly 15 or 20 of the Rowdy leaders remained inside the Decatur Street building too long. By the time they tried to leave, armed volunteers had surrounded it. They surrendered without resistance. That created another practical problem. Where do you put 15 or 20 prisoners when your jail can barely hold the people already inside? Only the men considered most serious offenders could be placed in the small calaboose. The others had to be kept under guard in a private building because Atlanta did not possess enough secure detention space. That single detail says almost everything about the city at this moment. Atlanta was trying to suppress what its own historians later called a rebellion. It did not have enough jail. The following day, crowds gathered for the trials. Martin says the street in front of the city hall became packed with people watching what would happen. One defendant after another was convicted. The mayor imposed fines up to the maximum allowed by Atlanta's charter, and men who could not or would not pay were remanded to jail. Norcross had finally achieved what he had failed to achieve during the earlier courtroom incident. The prisoners stayed under government control. For several weeks afterward, the volunteer police remained active because municipal leaders feared renewed violence. Anonymous threats continued to reach Norcross, and resentment remained especially strong in the rough drinking districts. But the organised effort to frighten him out of office had failed. Later writers treated the moment as the point when Atlanta's municipal government finally established supremacy over the rowdy faction. E. Y. Clarke's 19th century history described the armed citizen response as the action that confirmed the authority of the municipality and of the citizens supporting it. John Hornady later presented the episode in similarly favourable terms, describing Norcross as the representative of a city finally determined to impose order. That interpretation needs one qualification. Atlanta had not suddenly developed a strong government. It had demonstrated that a weak government could call enough private citizens into the streets to defeat a particular group of opponents. Those are different things. The jail was still primitive. The police force was still small. The mayor was still performing several jobs at once. The city still depended on personal loyalty and armed volunteers during a major crisis. And disorder had not vanished. The very success of the crackdown changed where disorder happened. Murrell's Row had become less comfortable for gamblers and other people who had depended on weak enforcement. Some moved away. Others moderated their behaviour. Some shifted toward districts outside the city limits, including Snake Nation and Slab Town. Martin explicitly connects the tightening of order inside Atlanta with the movement of what he called the worst elements toward those suburban settlements. Snake Nation therefore benefited from Atlanta becoming stricter. The city was creating pressure. The pressure pushed people outward. A gambler who could no longer operate as openly on Decatur Street could still find customers beyond the boundary. A woman driven from one vice district could move to another. A saloon patron who disliked the new regulations could walk outside the city. A rowdy organiser who no longer felt safe defying Norcross downtown could still find sympathetic company elsewhere. The physical distance involved was not great enough to break the connection. Atlanta's customers continued arriving. The municipal line simply made enforcement more complicated. This is where the jailbreak stories become especially relevant. They were not only amusing examples of primitive city life, they taught both sides something. The rowdies learned that institutions could be defeated if enough people acted together. You could lift a jail, you could free a prisoner, you could threaten a mayor, you could drag a cannon into a street. For several years, informal force had worked often enough that people developed confidence in it. The Moral Party learned something similar. When the ordinary police system was insufficient, organised citizens could change the situation. Norcross had called armed supporters into the streets. The rowdy gathering collapsed. The crisis ended. The city became more orderly. From the Moral Party's perspective, civilian action had worked where weak institutions had struggled. That was a dangerous lesson to carry forward. There was a crucial difference between what had just happened in Atlanta and what was about to happen outside it. Norcross's volunteer police had been publicly called by the mayor and council during an armed challenge to city authority. They operated, at least in theory, under municipal direction. The people they arrested were brought before a court. Fines were imposed according to the charter. Whatever we think about the fairness of the political environment, there was still a legal structure around the crackdown. Snake Nation presented a different problem. Atlanta could not simply reproduce the same process there. The settlement stood outside the municipal boundary. Norcross could not treat every drinking house there as though it were an Atlanta establishment violating an Atlanta ordinance. The moral party had defeated its enemies where the city possessed legal authority. Beyond the line, the same men had fewer tools. County law remained. State law remained. Serious crimes could still be prosecuted. But the constant local pressure that had broken the rowdy hold inside Atlanta was harder to apply. To reformers, the result looked almost insulting. They could patrol Atlanta. They could hold court. They could build a stronger jail. They could threaten saloon owners with fines. And a man interested in the same gambling, drinking, or prostitution could leave the regulated area and find it again after a short walk. This created a new kind of anger. The rowdies had failed to overthrow the mayor. Their cannon had failed. Their prisoners were now staying in jail more reliably. Their political organisation was weakening. Yet the social world that had produced them survived outside Atlanta's reach. Snake Nation was becoming more concentrated as a symbol of that survival. Modern summaries sometimes describe the district as though Snake Nation itself had temporarily conquered Atlanta after the election. That is too simple. The surviving early sources distinguish between the rowdy violence inside the city, particularly around places such as Murrell's Row, and Snake Nation beyond the limits. Later memory blended these groups together because the rowdy faction drew support from the same vice culture, and because people displaced by the crackdown moved outward. The more accurate story is also more interesting. Atlanta did not lose control because one neighborhood somehow became stronger than the entire city. Atlanta lost control because Atlanta barely possessed the institutions required for control in the first place. Its jail could be lifted. Its police manpower could be outnumbered. Its mayor could be threatened face to face. Its political opponents could obtain artillery within a short distance of town. And its boundaries stopped municipal regulations while the people being regulated simply continued walking. Norcross had managed to solve the first half of that problem through organisation and force. He had shown that the mayor would not resign. He had shown that armed rowdies could be arrested. He had shown that a crowd did not automatically outrank the city council. What remained was the problem sitting outside the circle. Snake Nation. The settlement continued operating because the legal method that had worked inside Atlanta did not reach it in the same way. The people who wanted it gone could have accepted that limitation and worked through county authorities. They could have pursued annexation. They could have waited for ordinary courts to act against specific crimes. Some probably preferred exactly those approaches. Others had recently watched 100 armed citizens restore order in Atlanta when the regular police could not. They began to think about using organised citizens again. Only this time there would be no public call from the mayor, no uniformed civic patrol, no crowded municipal trial afterward. The men who went towards Snake Nation would hide their faces. By the time Atlanta's reformers turned their attention fully towards Snake Nation, they had already learned one lesson from the fight with the rowdies. Organised force worked. Jonathan Norcross had survived threats against his life and property. The rowdies had dragged a cannon into Atlanta and fired it outside his store. The city's ordinary police had been too weak to guarantee control, so the mayor called on armed citizens to support the municipal government. Those volunteers organised, surrounded a rowdy meeting place, arrested several leaders, and ended the immediate challenge without the large street battle many residents had feared. Early Atlanta histories treated that confrontation as the moment the new administration finally established authority inside the city. But the success created another problem. The crackdown worked best inside Atlanta's legal boundary. Snake Nation was outside it. So was another rough settlement known as Slab Town. When pressure increased around places such as Murrell's Row, some people associated with Atlanta's vice economy moved outward. Thomas H. Martin's 1902 history says men and women displaced from the better police parts of the city gathered in Snake Nation and Slab Town and continued activities that reformers had spent years trying to suppress. Because the settlement stood beyond Atlanta's municipal limits, The city could not simply apply all of its ordinances there as though they were downtown streets. This distinction is important because later versions of the story often make what happened next sound like an official military operation ordered by Mayor Norcross. The surviving evidence does not support saying that confidently. Norcross unquestionably led Atlanta's reform government. His election helped create the conditions that drove the campaign against the rowdy districts. The people who destroyed Snake Nation were associated in later histories with the reforming or moral element of Atlanta, but the early accounts describe the actual attackers as a large group of disguised citizens. They do not provide clear evidence that Norcross personally issued an official order telling them to burn the settlement. That difference changes the character of the event. Atlanta had spent years complaining that Snake Nation represented lawlessness. Then some of the people who wanted law and order decided to act outside ordinary legal procedure themselves. There was no municipal trial deciding that every building in Snake Nation should be destroyed. There was no court hearing for every resident. There was no ordinary eviction process. The people who went there at night did not arrive as a normal police patrol. They concealed their identities. Martin describes them as disguised Atlantans and later refers to the men involved by the familiar vigilante label White Caps. E. Y. Clark, writing in the 19th century, similarly described a body of disguised citizens attacking Snake Nation at night. The exact date of the attack is less secure than many modern summaries make it appear. Sources consistently place the destruction in the period following the Moral Party's victory and the suppression of the rowdy resistance in the early 1850s. Local Castleberry Hill history associates it with Norcross's 1851 victory, while Martin describes it as occurring shortly after the confrontations that marked the beginning of Norcross's administration. The available accounts are much clearer about what happened than about the exact night on which every action occurred, so rather than invent an exact evening and hour that the evidence does not give us, stay with what we know. It was night time. A sizable group of men prepared to move against the settlements. They did not go only to Snake Nation. Martin says they targeted both Snake Nation and Slab Town. They concealed who they were, and they carried enough force to make resistance extremely difficult. This was not a group of reformers arriving to hand out notices. The men living in the targeted shanties were physically assaulted. Martin says they were whipped and warned to leave the area. Women in the settlements were seized and taken away by force. His account says they were transported almost as far as Decatur before being released with warnings not to return. Modern summaries usually describe this more directly as kidnapping, which is a fair description of people being forcibly taken from their homes and carried miles away without legal process. Then the attackers turned to the buildings. The structures in Snake Nation were mostly rough wooden shanties. That made destroying them easy. Atlanta itself had already learned how vulnerable wooden settlements were to fire. The young city had suffered its first recorded fires around 1850, and firefighting depended largely on improvised bucket brigades. There was no modern fire department capable of arriving with engines, hydrants, hoses, breathing equipment, and organised crews. In Snake Nation, nobody was trying to save the buildings anyway. The attackers set them on fire deliberately. Clark's early history describes them using axes and fire to destroy the settlement after driving out the inhabitants. Martin says the shanties of Snake Nation and Slab Town were burned after the residents had been assaulted and expelled. Both accounts agree that the destruction was extensive enough that the old settlements did not simply resume business once the attackers went home. Imagine the practical situation without adding anything the sources cannot prove. You live in a cheap wooden structure outside Atlanta. Whatever you do for a living, whatever your reputation, whatever your connection to the saloons or gambling houses around you, this is where your possessions are. Furniture is limited, clothing is expensive. Anything stored inside that building matters. There is no insurance payment guaranteed after a vigilante group burns the structure. There is no government emergency shelter waiting. There is no organisation arriving the next morning with temporary housing. If the crowd orders you out and burns the building behind you, the question of where you sleep next becomes your problem immediately. This is why describing the destruction only as the closing of a red light district hides much of what happened. Buildings were not businesses alone. People lived in them. Some undoubtedly operated saloons, gambling rooms, brothels, and other establishments that had helped give Snake Nation its reputation. Others may simply have rented rooms nearby or depended economically on the district. The surviving histories do not give us a household-by-household record detailed enough to identify exactly who occupied every structure on the night of the attack. The vigilantes do not appear to have cared much about making those distinctions. Their objective was removal. They wanted the settlement gone. The treatment of the women is especially revealing. For years, prostitution had been used by reformers as evidence that places such as Snake Nation were corrupting Atlanta. The women involved were discussed as part of a public problem. When the vigilantes attacked, those same women were not offered protection from whatever exploitation may have existed around them. They were physically taken away. Martin's language toward them is openly contemptuous, which reflects the attitudes of the period and of the author. His history treats their expulsion as part of the successful cleanup of Atlanta, rather than asking what happened to them afterward. We do not know most of their names. We do not know where most went. Some may have returned to other vice districts. Some may have left Atlanta. Some may have found other work. Some may have continued prostitution somewhere less visible. The historical record becomes quiet exactly where their individual stories would begin. That silence also tells us something about the way Atlanta remembered Snake Nation. Later civic histories were written largely from the perspective of the people who believed the settlement deserved to disappear. Clark's 1887 history presents its destruction as the victory of law and order over indecency. Martin, writing in 1902, uses even stronger moral language and portrays the destruction as an effective example that prevented similar settlements from immediately reappearing. Neither account spends much time questioning the legality of masked citizens whipping residents, forcibly transporting women, and burning private structures. That reaction might seem strange after everything we have covered. The Moral Party had campaigned against lawlessness. Norcross had risked his life defending municipal authority. Armed citizens had been organised specifically to ensure that arrests and court decisions would be respected. Then members of the same broad reforming community participated in violence without those procedures. The contradiction was obvious. It simply was not treated as especially troubling by the historians who admired the result. That is because 19th century ideas about vigilantism could differ sharply from modern assumptions. In places where formal law enforcement was weak, groups of citizens sometimes claimed that extraordinary action was necessary to protect the community. They might call themselves vigilance committees or justify their actions as enforcement of standards that government had failed to maintain. Sometimes those groups pursued people accused of real crimes. Sometimes they punished people without reliable evidence. Sometimes they protected property. Sometimes they protected racial, economic, or political hierarchies. And sometimes the same group could do more than one of those things. The defining problem was that they decided for themselves when ordinary law was insufficient. Snake Nation became one of early Atlanta's clearest examples. The reformers had legitimate reasons to complain about crime. Historical records do identify serious violence in the area. A pioneer history records a killing near Snake Nation in 1851, around the Peters Street crossing of the Macon and Western Railway. Other killings occurred in and around early Atlanta during the same period, reinforcing the sense among residents that public safety was a genuine concern. But the existence of crime does not turn masked arson into a normal judicial process. That is what makes the event more useful historically than the simpler story of good citizens defeating criminals. Atlanta was not choosing between law and lawlessness in a clean way. It was choosing between competing forms of authority. The rowdies had used intimidation, violent crowds, jailbreaks, and a cannon to resist municipal government. The moral faction defeated them partly by assembling armed citizens in support of that government. Then unidentified members of the reforming community went beyond the government's direct legal reach and imposed their preferred order themselves. Both sides were willing to use force. They disagreed over what the force was for. The rowdies wanted to preserve a permissive social world in which drinking, gambling and related businesses could operate with limited interference. The moral reformers wanted Atlanta to become a more controlled commercial city. Snake Nation stood between those visions. Once the shanties were burning, the argument was being settled physically rather than electorally. The fire would have moved quickly through cheap wooden structures. No elaborate architecture had to collapse. These were not brick warehouses or substantial townhouses. That made the work of destruction much easier than it would have been later in the century. Boards burned, roofs failed. Possessions left behind went with them. Anything that survived the first flames could be damaged by heat, smoke, or deliberate destruction. The attackers did not need to occupy the district afterward. Fire did the remaining work. GPB's modern retelling says the neighborhood was burned to the ground, while the Downtown Atlanta account calls the event a vigilante arson campaign. Both draw on the same broader historical tradition that the moral faction's attack destroyed Snake Nation as the vice settlement Atlanta had known. The phrase "burn to the ground" should still be understood as a description of the targeted shanty settlement, rather than a claim that every future block of what is now Castleberry Hill became an empty field permanently. The area did not disappear geographically. People would return, businesses would return, transportation remained, land remained valuable. What disappeared was Snake Nation, as that particular organised shanty district. Martin specifically says the destruction was effective enough that the settlements were not rebuilt in the same form immediately afterward. Clark likewise says Snake Nation was never rebuilt as the village Atlanta had known. That distinction matters because later development transformed the area instead of abandoning it. The same location that had made Snake Nation useful to saloons and gambling houses also made the land valuable for more respectable commerce. It sat close to railroad infrastructure. Road connections were already established. Atlanta was expanding. Warehousing, manufacturing, grocery businesses and other commercial activities could use the same transportation advantages that the vice economy had used. The reformers were not clearing a distant wilderness. They were clearing land beside a growing transportation centre. That raises another question that the surviving sources cannot answer neatly. How much of the attack was motivated by morality, and how much by property and economic development? There is good evidence for moral motivation. The people involved belonged to a reform movement that had spent years condemning drinking, gambling, prostitution and public disorder. Contemporary and early historians consistently frame the destruction in those terms. There was also an obvious economic context. Atlanta's merchants wanted a stable city. Nearby land was becoming more valuable. Railroad expansion was increasing commercial opportunities. A rough shanty district occupied by poor residents and vice businesses was not the type of development the merchant class wanted near an expanding railroad centre. It would be too strong to claim that the entire attack was secretly a real estate scheme, unless better evidence demonstrated that. But it would also be unrealistic to pretend economic interests were irrelevant. Respectability and property values frequently supported one another. A district considered dangerous was bad for nearby investment. Remove the district, and the same land could be put to different uses. What happened afterward shows how quickly that possibility became real. The violence also had a political effect. The Free and Rowdy faction had already lost the mayor's office. Its attempt to intimidate Norcross had failed. Its armed organisation had been broken. Now one of the physical environments associated with its supporters had been destroyed. Political defeat had been followed by social displacement. For the rowdies, there was no easy route back to the position they had held when Atlanta's first 3 mayors came from their side. That does not mean drinking, gambling, prostitution or crime disappeared from Atlanta. They did not. No city has ever eliminated those activities by burning one neighbourhood. Vice moved. Businesses reopened elsewhere. new districts developed. As Atlanta grew, prostitution and gambling would appear in other forms and other locations. What changed was the ability of Snake Nation to function as a concentrated settlement, openly identified with the political culture that had resisted the moral party. That Atlanta was gone. There is a tendency in historical storytelling to look for a moment when a city becomes civilized. One election, one reformer, one new police department, one destroyed vice district. Real cities do not change that neatly. Atlanta did not become orderly because Snake Nation burned. Crime continued. Political violence continued. Disputes about alcohol continued for generations. Prostitution continued. Later, Atlanta would experience violence on a scale far beyond anything the rowdies had produced. The Civil War was only a little more than a decade away, and much of Atlanta itself would eventually be destroyed during the conflict. So the burning of Snake Nation was not the moment disorder ended. It was the moment one particular struggle over who had the right to define order was decided. The moral party won. Its version of Atlanta became dominant. Later civic historians celebrated that result because the city that developed afterward looked much more like the commercial Atlanta they recognized. That perspective explains why the violence was often treated almost casually. The masked attackers became respectable citizens restoring order. The people beaten and displaced became obstacles. The burned buildings became evidence of progress. Once you know how the event actually happened, that tidy interpretation becomes difficult to maintain. The same act can accomplish something many citizens want and still be unlawful. Snake Nation may genuinely have contained dangerous establishments. Residents may genuinely have feared violence there. The municipal boundary may genuinely have made regulation frustrating. None of those facts creates a court proceeding where none existed. The men who covered their identities understood at minimum that anonymity was useful. They went at night. They removed the residents. They punished people themselves. They burned the structures. Then they returned to Atlanta. By morning, the physical problem that city government had failed to solve through ordinary regulation had been changed permanently. Smoke would have remained. Blackened timbers would have remained. The road remained. The railroad remained. And Atlanta continued growing. The people who celebrated the destruction could now point toward the old district and say that Snake Nation was finished. Geographically, they were wrong. The land was still much too valuable to stay empty. Within the years that followed, merchants began establishing businesses around the same streets. The old Whitehall Road became Peters Street. Commercial activity increased. By the period around the Civil War, the district was beginning to acquire a very different identity, and the family name that would eventually replace Snake Nation on Atlanta's map was becoming associated with property there, Castleberry. The shanties had burned, but Atlanta had not finished with the land beneath them. The destruction of Snake Nation did not leave an empty stretch of land outside Atlanta for very long. That would have been almost impossible. The settlement had occupied useful ground. It stood close to the railroad, close to the growing commercial centre, and along the road that connected Atlanta with communities farther south and west. The same location that had attracted saloons, gambling rooms, cheap lodging, and other businesses serving railroad workers and travellers was also useful to merchants who wanted warehouses, shops, manufacturing buildings, and access to freight. Burning the shanties changed who could use the land. It did not change why the land mattered. During the years that followed, the name Snake Nation gradually disappeared from ordinary descriptions of the area. Whitehall Road became Peters Street around the early 1850s, named for railroad businessman Richard Peters. A second family name also became increasingly connected with the neighbourhood. The Castleberry family owned property and operated businesses there, and the rise along Walker Street between Fair and Stonewall Streets eventually became known as Castleberry Hill. Local historical records describe the name becoming associated with the area sometime between the late 1850s and the years immediately after the Civil War. That change in names was not merely cosmetic, it reflected a larger change in Atlanta. Snake Nation had belonged to the period when Atlanta was still a rough railroad settlement, struggling to establish municipal authority. Castleberry Hill developed as Atlanta became a more permanent commercial and industrial city. The railroad remained at the centre of everything. If you had somehow returned to the old Snake Nation area 10 or 15 years after the Morrill Party's campaign against it, you would still have heard locomotives nearby. You would still have seen wagons. You would still have encountered workers, merchants, travellers, and people looking for temporary employment. What changed was the scale and purpose of the activity. Atlanta's population continued rising rapidly. By 1860, the city had 9,554 residents, several times the number it had possessed around the period of the first mayoral elections. The town that Jonathan Norcross and the rowdies had fought over was turning into one of the most important transportation centres in the Deep South. The figures matter because they explain why the old conditions could not last. When Atlanta contained only a few thousand people, a collection of wooden shanties beside a major road could become one of the best-known districts in town. As the city approached 10,000 people and its railroad connections multiplied, the economics changed. Land close to freight lines became more valuable. A merchant could use it. A warehouse owner could use it. A manufacturer could use it. A grocer receiving large quantities of goods could use it. People with enough money to build permanent structures could gradually replace people living and working from temporary ones. That process did not happen in a single week after the vigilantes left Snake Nation. There was no morning when Atlanta woke up and found a complete industrial district standing where the shanties had burned. Development took time, but local histories of Castleberry Hill indicate that by the Civil War period, the neighbourhood was already beginning to acquire industries connected with building materials, terracotta, cotton storage, groceries, and railroad commerce. The old Vice District was giving way to a mixed area of residences, workshops, merchants, and industrial activity. Among the people associated with that transition were members of the Castleberry family. Historical accounts do not always present the family details in exactly the same way. Some identify Daniel Castleberry as the early settler and landowner, whose property gave the hill its name. Local preservation material also records a prominent Castleberry family grocery, and substantial family property along Peters Street during the years around the Civil War. The safest conclusion is that the family had enough land and commercial presence in the area for its surname to replace the older, and much less respectable name in local usage. A grocery business in 19th century Atlanta was not necessarily a small neighbourhood shop of the kind we picture today. Grocers could participate in wholesale as well as retail trade. They handled barrels, sacks, preserved foods, agricultural products, imported goods, and supplies arriving by rail. A location close to the railroad made that kind of business especially practical. The Castleberry name therefore belonged naturally to the new economy developing there. The transition also tells us something about what had really defeated Snake Nation. The vigilante attack destroyed the physical settlement. Commercial expansion prevented it from easily returning in the same form. If the land had remained economically unimportant, another collection of shanties might have appeared. Instead, Atlanta continued moving toward it. Property was subdivided. Businesses were established. Roads became more important. The railroad traffic increased. A district associated with temporary structures and loosely regulated entertainment was being absorbed into a city that increasingly valued permanent commercial development. That did not mean Atlanta had become morally pure, far from it. Saloons continued operating elsewhere. Gambling continued. Prostitution continued. Violence continued. Atlanta's later history would contain new red light districts, new political scandals, and new struggles over alcohol. Snake Nation ended as a place. The activities associated with it did not end as human behaviour. That distinction is important because later histories sometimes describe the moral party's victory as though Atlanta solved vice in 1851. It did not. The city changed where vice could operate and how openly it could challenge municipal authority. The larger victory was political. After the confrontation with Norcross, the free and rowdy faction never again possessed the same position it had enjoyed when Atlanta's first 3 mayors came from its side. The city government had demonstrated that it could enforce its authority when challenged directly. That mattered more over the long term than whether one particular gambling room closed. Atlanta now had a stronger expectation that city officials could regulate public behaviour. Police organisation gradually improved. Municipal institutions became more substantial. The physical city expanded. Places that had once sat conveniently outside the city's reach were increasingly drawn into Atlanta's growth. The old frontier condition was disappearing. Then the Civil War changed everything. Atlanta's importance as a railroad centre made it economically successful during the 1850s. The same railroad network made it a major military target during the 1860s. Rail lines connected Atlanta with important parts of the Confederacy. Supplies, troops, ammunition, food, clothing, and military equipment could move through the city. Manufacturing facilities supporting the Confederate war effort operated there. The railroad town had become strategically valuable. That made Atlanta worth capturing. Union forces under Major General William T. Sherman spent months campaigning toward the city in 1864. After a series of battles and movements around Atlanta, Confederate forces evacuated. Atlanta fell to Union forces on September 2nd, 1864. Later that year, before Sherman began his march to the sea, military facilities and large portions of the city were destroyed. Local Castleberry Hill history records the major burning of Atlanta on November the 15th, 1864, as part of the destruction that preceded Sherman's departure. For anyone who had remembered the burning of Snake Nation roughly 13 years earlier, the scale would have been incomparable. The vigilante attack had destroyed a rough settlement. The Civil War damaged an entire city. Railroad structures were obvious targets because the railroad was one of the main reasons Atlanta mattered militarily. Warehouses, workshops, industrial properties, and other buildings near transportation corridors were especially vulnerable. The district that had grown from the old Snake Nation ground therefore entered another period of destruction and rebuilding. This time, the rebuilding would happen much faster and on a much larger scale. Atlanta's post-war recovery became one of the defining features of the city's identity. The population returned, rail lines were repaired, merchants reopened businesses, construction resumed, people looking for work arrived. A city whose transportation system had helped cause its destruction used transportation to rebuild itself. Castleberry Hill benefited from that process because it remained exactly where it had always been, close to the railroads and close to downtown. The neighbourhood developed first as a mixture of homes and businesses. Peters Street became the principal commercial corridor, serving local residents while also supporting businesses connected with railroad traffic. Labourers lived nearby because walking distance mattered. Carpenters, clerks, blacksmiths, tailors, butchers, grocers, saloon keepers, and other tradespeople could live relatively close to their workplaces. An 1878 city directory shows exactly this variety of occupations in the district. That list gives us a better sense of the neighbourhood than the word industrial does by itself. A blacksmith might begin work early. A butcher handled meat for local sale. A carpenter moved between construction jobs. A clerk worked behind a counter or in an office. A labourer might be unloading freight. A grocer dealt with suppliers and customers. A saloon keeper was still there too. That last occupation is worth noticing. Atlanta had burned Snake Nation. It had not burned alcohol out of Atlanta. The difference was that saloons now existed inside a district increasingly governed by ordinary city institutions, rather than forming the political centre of an openly defiant shanty settlement. The neighbourhood was becoming part of Atlanta rather than a challenge beside it. Transportation encouraged that integration. In 1871, Atlanta's first horse-drawn trolley line was routed along Peter Street, giving the commercial strip an important advantage. The trolley connected the district more directly with other parts of Atlanta and increased the movement of customers and workers through the neighborhood. Think about how much had changed in 20 years. During the Snake Nation period, one of the defining characteristics of the area had been its position beyond the convenient reach of municipal control. Now, Atlanta's first street railway was passing through it. The city that had once struggled to police the place was physically connecting it to the urban transportation system. That is one of the clearest signs that the old relationship had ended. A horse-drawn streetcar was hardly modern by our standards. It moved on rails embedded in the street and depended on horses rather than electricity. But compared with walking through mud or riding in an ordinary wagon, it represented a major improvement in urban transportation. People could travel farther while still working or shopping in the central city. Businesses along the route gained customers. Property near stops became more attractive. Peter Street's commercial importance increased. Another feature of the neighbourhood showed how closely its future remained tied to railroads. The tracks did not merely run beside Castleberry Hill. They shaped the street pattern. They cut across the district and forced residents to build around them. A wooden trestle on Nelson Street carried traffic above the railroad and was probably Atlanta's first street bridge crossing above rail tracks. Most other crossings in the area remained at grade for a time, meaning pedestrians, wagons, and eventually streetcars had to deal directly with passing trains. Railroad noise would have been a permanent part of daily life. A locomotive arriving did not politely disappear into the background. There was steam, metal, brakes, whistles, freight being moved, workers shouting, animals reacting to the noise, coal smoke. For the people who lived near the tracks, this was normal. And that normality is another difference between Castleberry Hill and the old Snake Nation. Snake Nation had made money from travellers. Castleberry Hill increasingly made money from freight. The customer did not always have to walk into a saloon carrying cash. A railroad car could arrive carrying enough goods to fill a warehouse. That shift encouraged bigger buildings. Wooden shanties were useful when the business required little more than a room, a bottle, a table, and customers. Warehousing demanded something more substantial. Owners wanted brick, large floor areas, loading access, structures capable of handling heavy goods. Fire resistance became increasingly important. Businesses that planned to remain for years invested differently from businesses that expected to disappear if authorities became inconvenient. This development accelerated toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. Commercial and industrial buildings gradually replaced more residential structures. Castleberry Hill became one of Atlanta's principal warehouse districts, closely associated with rail distribution. The continuous rows of early 20th century industrial buildings that survive today are the main reason the district was eventually recognised for its historic architecture. The National Park Service lists Castleberry Hill on the National Register of Historic Places with significance in commerce, transportation, community planning, development and architecture. The people living there changed as well. By 1892, local preservation history records a substantial increase in non-white residents, especially in the southern section of Walker Street. Part of that change resulted from commercial and industrial expansion displacing housing, while white residents had increasing access to homes elsewhere. New residences appeared around Nelson, Haynes, and Walker Streets, along with the Walker Street Methodist Episcopal Church. Atlanta was changing racially as well as economically. This was the post-Reconstruction South, and black Atlantans faced growing segregation and discrimination as white political leaders created the system that would become known as Jim Crow. So we should be careful about describing the transformation of Castleberry Hill simply as progress. The district became more developed, its buildings became more permanent, its transportation improved, its commercial importance increased. None of that meant life became equally secure or free for everyone who lived there. Atlanta could become more orderly while becoming more racially oppressive, it could become richer while poor workers remained vulnerable. A city's development does not move every part of society in the same direction. The neighbourhood continued shifting toward industry during the first decades of the 20th century. Peter Street still served local shops and services, but businesses increasingly operated on a citywide and regional scale. During the boom years of the late 1910s and early 1920s, major meatpacking firms including Swift & Company and Kingen & Company operated facilities there. Railroad connections made the neighbourhood ideal for companies moving perishable goods and manufactured products through Atlanta. By then, the physical landscape would have been almost unrecognisable to someone from Snake Nation. Brick warehouses stood where rough buildings had once dominated. Freight moved through large industrial structures. Railroad sidings served businesses. Loading docks faced streets and tracks. Commercial signs identified companies dealing in meat, building materials, groceries, machinery and other goods. Atlanta had become a regional distribution centre. Castleberry Hill had become one of the places that made that distribution possible. The process completed the reversal that had begun after the vigilante attack. Snake Nation had been a district Atlanta's leading merchants considered an obstacle to the city they wanted. Castleberry Hill became part of the commercial machinery of that city. There is an irony in that. The people who condemned Snake Nation complained that it depended on the railroad population. They were correct. Saloons needed railroad workers. Gamblers needed travellers. Brothels needed customers. Confidence men needed strangers. But the respectable district that replaced Snake Nation depended on the railroad just as completely. Its warehouses needed freight. Its manufacturers needed raw materials. Its grocers needed shipments. Its labourers needed jobs. Its stores needed customers. The railroad was never the moral force in this story. It simply created opportunity. Different people used that opportunity in different ways. Atlanta's leaders preferred warehouses to gambling houses, because warehouses produced the kind of growth they wanted. That preference eventually reshaped the neighbourhood. The memory of Snake Nation faded enough that later generations could live and work there without knowing the name. By the 20th century, Castleberry Hill was primarily known as a warehouse, an industrial district, rather than as the location of Atlanta's earliest political war over vice. Then that economy changed too. After World War II, transportation and industry began moving away from older central city districts. Trucks became more important relative to rail freight. Companies wanted larger sites with easier highway access. Residents moved toward expanding suburbs. Older warehouses became less useful for the businesses that had built them. Castleberry Hill declined. Buildings were left vacant or used only partially. The neighbourhood that had once benefited enormously from being beside the railroad now suffered as that advantage became less important. By the 1980s, however, the same large industrial spaces began attracting a different population. Artists moved into old warehouses. Some converted them into studios and living spaces. Loft development expanded. The Castleberry Hill Neighbourhood Association records that by 1992, the area contained around 120 lofts housing roughly 150 residents. That transformation is far beyond the years of Snake Nation, but it helps explain why the old story survived. Once people began trying to preserve the warehouse buildings, they researched what had existed before the warehouses. They found the Castleberry family, they found Peter Street, they found Whitehall Road, and behind all of those names, they found Snake Nation. The neighbourhood was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1985. The National Park Service recognises it for its commercial, transportation, architectural and development history. Atlanta later designated Castleberry Hill as a local landmark district in 2006. That means a place once destroyed partly because respectable Atlantans wanted to erase what it represented is now protected partly because Atlantans want to preserve what came afterward. The buildings being preserved are mostly not buildings from Snake Nation. The vigilante destruction, the Civil War, redevelopment, fire, demolition, and industrial construction removed the physical shanty district long ago. What survives is the street pattern, the relationship to the railroad, the commercial architecture, the name Castleberry Hill, and the historical record telling us what occupied the land before those things. Walk through the district now, and the easiest history to see is the warehouse era. Brick walls survive, old industrial openings survive, rail lines still define the landscape. Buildings constructed for freight have been converted into residences, restaurants, galleries, and other businesses. The Snake Nation period is harder to see because there are few physical remains available to announce it. There is no preserved rowdy saloon waiting with its original furniture. There is no surviving shanty labelled as a gambling house. There is no cannon sitting permanently on Peter Street marking the political crisis. Most of what we know comes from newspapers, pioneer recollections, early histories, municipal records, and the later work of historians trying to reconstruct the city before the Civil War. That makes Snake Nation unusually dependent on memory. And memory can simplify. Early Atlanta's respectable historians often told the story this way. The city was young and lawless, the rowdies controlled politics, Jonathan Norcross and the Moral Party defeated them. Good citizens destroyed Snake Nation, and Atlanta became respectable. There is truth inside that sequence. There is also a great deal missing. The rowdies really did use intimidation and violence. The cannon was real. The jail problems were real. Snake Nation really was associated with gambling, drinking, prostitution and crime. Norcross really did represent a political shift towards stronger municipal authority. The vigilantes really did destroy the settlement, but the people who claimed to restore law also stepped outside it. The residents driven from Snake Nation were not all carefully tried and convicted before their homes were burned. Women were forcibly removed, men were beaten. Anonymous citizens decided what punishment should be imposed. That complicates the idea that Atlanta simply became lawful by defeating lawless people. What Atlanta actually became was stronger. Its merchant class became stronger. Its municipal government became stronger. Its property system became stronger. Its ability to decide which activities belonged near the commercial centre became stronger. As those institutions strengthened, districts that could flourish in the gaps between jurisdictions became harder to maintain. Snake Nation belonged to those gaps. It appeared because Atlanta grew faster than its ability to govern. It became politically important because saloon culture had enough voters and allies to influence elections. It survived early reform efforts because municipal authority was weak and geographically limited. It disappeared when its political allies lost power. Armed citizens were mobilized against the rowdies, vigilantes destroyed the settlement, and commercial growth made the land useful for something Atlanta's leaders valued more. The name changed, the buildings changed, the people changed, but the location continued doing what it had always done. It served the movement created by Atlanta's transportation network. First travelers and railroad workers brought money to saloons and gambling rooms. Then freight brought money to warehouses and wholesalers. Later abandoned warehouses brought artists looking for cheap space. The businesses were different, but the neighbourhood kept adapting to whatever kind of Atlanta existed around it. That is why Snake Nation matters beyond the colourful stories about gamblers, brothels, jailbreaks, and a cannon being dragged into the street. It shows us Atlanta before its institutions were secure. The city did not begin respectable. Respectability had to be defined. It had to win elections. It had to create enforcement. It had to decide which businesses it wanted and which people it was prepared to push away. Sometimes it used law. Sometimes it used politics. And on the night Snake Nation was destroyed, some Atlantans decided that neither was moving quickly enough and used fire instead. What rose afterward was not a city without disorder. It was a city increasingly capable of controlling where disorder was allowed to exist. The railroad town continued growing. Peters Street became a commercial corridor. Castleberry Hill became a working neighbourhood of labourers, craftsmen, merchants, warehouses, and industry. Atlanta survived the Civil War, rebuilt, expanded, and turned itself into the regional commercial centre its early boosters had wanted. And the place once called Snake Nation became part of that success rather than a settlement standing just beyond its reach. So if you ever find yourself near Castleberry Hill and look at the brick warehouses, the railroad cuts, and the streets running south from downtown, it is worth remembering that Atlanta's struggle to control this ground began before most of those buildings existed. Before the warehouses, there were shanties. Before the industrial companies, there were saloons. Before Castleberry Hill, there was Snake Nation. And before Atlanta could become the city its merchants wanted, it first had to decide who was going to control it.